of Botany and Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. He has a doctorate in genetics from the University of Ferrara in Italy and a doctorate in botany from the University of Connecticut. He has been a postdoctoral associate at Brown University. His academic research focuses on the ecology and evolution of genotype-environment interactions, that is, on the old nature versus nurture problem. He has published 48 technical papers in evolutionary biology. He has written 2 popular science books in Italian, The Romance of Life, on evolution for high school students, and The Road to the Stars, on the exploration of the solar system, co-authored with Franco Foresta Martin. Sinauer just published his technical book, Phenotypic Evolution, a Reaction Norm Perspective, co-authored with Carl Schlichting. And he is preparing Phenotypic Plasticity, Beyond Nature versus Nurture for Johns Hopkins University Press. He has been awarded the prestigious Dobzhansky Prize by the Society for the Study of Evolution, has twice won the Oak Ridge National Laboratory Science Alliance Research Award, and has been selected as Teacher of the Year by the University of Tennessee Mortarboard Faculty Appreciation Committee. As a skeptic, he has debated creationist Dwayne Gish and Christian theologian William Craig, has given talks to various skeptic and humanistic groups throughout the United States, and has published in Skeptic and Skeptical Inquirer. He is editor of the online skeptical magazine Reality Check. The negative proposition is debated by Dr. Dwayne T. Gish. Dr. Gish received a Bachelor of Science degree in biochemistry from the University of California at Los Angeles, a doctorate in biochemistry from the University of California at Berkeley. He was elected to the UCLA chapters of Phi Beta Kappa and Phi Sigma Upsilon, a chemical honorary fraternity. He has spent a total of 18 years in biochemical research, with 3 years at Cornell University Medical College in New York City, 4 years with the Virus Laboratory, University of California, Berkeley, and 11 years on the research staff of the Upjohn Company, a pharmaceutical firm, Kalamazoo, Michigan. During that time, Dr. Gish worked with 2 Nobel Prize winners. In 1971, Dr. Gish left his position with the Upjohn Company to join Dr. Henry Morris in his present work with the Institute for Creation Research, where he has served as Associate Director and Vice President. He has published approximately 40 technical articles in scientific journals. He is the author of numerous articles and several books on the subject of scientific evidence for creation. He has participated in nearly 300 debates and has lectured in 49 of the 50 states, in most provinces of Canada, and in about 30 foreign countries. He is a member of the American Chemical Society and is a fellow of the American Institute of Chemists. He is one of the founders and a board member of the Creation Research Society. He is married and has 4 children and several grandchildren. The order of battle. The affirmative, 60 minutes. The negative, 60 minutes. A 5-minute break. The first affirmative rebuttal, 15 minutes. The first negative rebuttal, 15 minutes. Affirmative conclusion, 5 minutes. And negative conclusion, 5 minutes. Questions from the audience, 45 minutes. The debate is concluded by 10:45. Audience, state your questions briefly and refrain from extraneous statements or commentary. Direct your questions to the affirmative or the negative. The moderator will read the question for answer, comment, and additional comment by one. Please withhold your applause until each speaker completes. An audience, please refrain from approaching the debaters during debate. They will be preparing in that time their rejoinders. The affirmative, 60 minutes. You may begin.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here. It's a lovely place. It's very different from the churches where I grew up in Rome, in Italy, but I recognize the same general feeling. And I'm very pleased to be here. This is the third time that I debate Dr. Gish in public. And actually, we never debated in private, so this is it. And I will try to make my case, hopefully in a little less than an hour, because I know that these debates can be taxing not only on the debaters, but on the audience as well. There is a lot to be said, unfortunately, so I'll try to be brief. Let's start with the slides. Do I have control of the slide projector? I guess I do. Yes, I do. Can we get the slides to fit the screen a little better? Now the focus is fine. Well, meantime, I'll go ahead. You'll miss something, but not a lot. First of all, let me make clear why I'm here and what is the spirit in which I'm here tonight. And that spirit is well summarized by a phrase that was uttered long ago by a philosopher named Spinoza. He said, "I have made a ceaseless effort not to ridicule, not to bewail, not to scorn human actions, but to understand them." And this is exactly the spirit that I'm here tonight. I don't want to make fun of anybody. I don't think there is anything funny about the whole thing. There is a lot of interesting stuff to be discussed, but certainly not make fun of anybody. And I have the utmost respect, not only for the audience, but of course for Dr. Gish in particular. That said, let's get to the fireworks. First of all, debating evolution and creation in one evening, it's a large task. And in fact, it's an overwhelming task. Because it's not just about debating creation and evolution, it's about debating a lot of other things. We'll be debating the nature of science tonight. To some extent, we'll debate also the nature of religion. Now, you understand that those are fairly large topics that cannot be covered entirely in one evening, especially in front of a general audience. This is not a classroom, so I cannot assume that anybody here knows a lot about either of these topics. But let me start with discussing what is science to begin with, in a couple of slides only. The goal of science is to present the best of our understanding of how nature works. That is, science is not concerned with the truth in the sense of the absolute knowledge of nature. Scientists believe that it is very difficult, if not impossible, to get to the truth by empirical means, and therefore the best we can do is to present our best understanding of how things are and work. Every scientific conclusion, therefore, is tentative, and it's taught only until we know better. That's what I do with my students at the university. That's what every conscientious teacher in every school on the planet does. Okay, we teach the best of what we know, but only until we know better. And often enough, we know better after a while. Why should we use science in order to uncover the truth about the natural world, or at least making our best guesses about the natural world? Philosophers have written tons of pages on this question. I have philosopher friends, and so I respect their work, but I don't particularly like philosophy because it sounds like after a while you keep talking and talking and not making any headway. My answer is very simple. It works. Most of you came here tonight with a car. I came here with an airplane, so did Dr. Gish. Some of you may have cellular phones. I'm sure almost everybody has a television or a VCR or things of that sort. Well, the only reason you got those things, I have a laptop computer right here with me, is because of science and because science works. If it didn't work, you wouldn't have those things. If something else was a better way of uncovering truth about the natural world, we will have that other way of doing things. So the only reason that I'm submitting here to use science to uncover truth about the natural world is simply because it works. I don't have any agenda, any other philosophical agenda about it. If it doesn't work, then we'll look for something else. But so far it has worked quite well. So let me start going through a series of general statements that creationists make. These are statements that you can find either in the writings of Dr. Gish or in the writings of other creationists that I have been perusing in the last few months since I got involved in this thing. One common statement is that evolution is just a theory, and therefore why should we believe what is just a theory? Well, the trick there is that there is a fundamental distinction between a theory in the vernacular sense, in the everyday language sense of the word, as, you know, it's a hunch. Well, it's just a theory. It's not more than a theory, or so on and so forth. And the scientific meaning of a theory. In science, a theory is a pretty complex matter. It's usually expressed in mathematical terms. It relies on a lot of evidence. It summarizes a lot of evidence, and it makes predictive statements about phenomena, natural phenomena. So you can't dismiss evolution on the basis that it's just a theory, because it isn't just a theory. It is a scientific theory. Other examples of scientific theories, which I'm sure you wouldn't dismiss that easily, are gravity, the theory of relativity, and the Copernican theory that says that the Earth rotates around the sun and not the other way around. Okay, so those are other examples of scientific theories, and evolution is exactly on the same level as on this one. Another common statement that is made by creation is that evolution is a theory, not fact. So, okay, now we know that it is a theory. Is it also a fact? Well, it depends on what you mean by fact and what you mean by theory. There are a lot of facts out there that support the theory of evolution. So in that sense, evolution is a series of facts. Of course, those facts can be interpreted in different ways. If you define evolution simply as change over time, as some people do, then evolution is a fact. There is nothing, nobody can actually deny that. You look at the fossil record and that's what you see. You see some kind of organism at one point in time and other kinds of organisms at another point in time. So things change. So from that point of view, evolution is a fact. How does that happen? It's a different matter, and that is where the theory comes into play. But let's look at some of the facts. The fossil record. We see in the fossil record a progression from simpler to more complex forms, which is summarized by this cartoon by Callahan. The cartoon caption says, "I'd like to thank all those who made it possible for me to be here tonight." And you can see that there is a long list of entities there, from primitive men to dinosaurs, all the way down to fishes and other things. Now, if the fossil record presents a progression from simpler to more complex things, that to a scientist is the hallmark of a natural process. Okay, things happen in nature more or less, with some exceptions, but happen in nature pretty much gradually. Now, the speed of this graduality is a matter of debate, and we will get to that in a second. But things don't just appear out of nothing if it is a natural phenomenon. Another fact about evolution is provided by what is called biogeography, that is the study of the distribution, the geographical distribution of animals and plants. For example, you can see over here two series of, well, I don't know if you can see them, but there are two series of animals, one over here and one over there. This is two different columns. These organisms live in two complete different parts of the world. These are African animals, these are Australian animals. But they're very, very similar to each other. That is, this one matches with this. It's the same kind of animal. It's a predator. It looks like a big cat. And so on and so forth. These are both insect-eater animals, and they both look like rodents, like rats. These both look like squirrels, and these both look like dogs. Except that this is a real squirrel, this is a real rat, this is actually a real dog. These are the Australian equivalent of those animals. Now, we all know that Australians do things in a kind of a bizarre way, maybe because they're upside down. But the point here is that these organisms evolved independently. They appeared gradually through time independently in Australia as opposed to being in Africa. Why was that? Did that occur independently? Because the two masses of land were not unified. They were separated for the last few hundred millions of years, which is when these organisms starting appeared. That kind of pattern is consistent with an evolutionary interpretation. A third fact about evolution, or that is consistent with the theory of evolution, is that every living organism is made of the same materials, or variation on the same materials. Everybody has DNA, proteins, and things of that sort. This is a molecule of DNA. This is a model of a molecule of DNA. That, to a scientist, points to common origin. Things were not just put into places at random, like we've seen with the biogeography argument, and things are actually related to each other. They're made of the same things, another hallmark of a natural phenomenon. Another fact about evolution: closely related species look very similar. If you look at the DNA of some species that scientists think of as closely related genetically and therefore evolutionarily, for example, lions and tigers, okay, they have a very similar DNA. To a scientist, what that means is that they share a relatively recent common ancestor. How did we come up with this idea? Well, it's the same situation when you have humans and you can tell the children of a couple from children that are not of that couple, okay? Because they look more similar to them. Okay? And why do they look more similar to them? Because they share a higher amount of their DNA with their parents than they share on average with anybody else in the community. So the same way in which to some extent you can tell descent in humans, and if you want to be precise, of course, you don't just look at how people look at, but you can look at their DNA. Okay? You've heard of DNA evidence now being admitted in court for the same purposes. Well, that's exactly what an evolutionary biologist does. Pretty much the same thing. We look at different species and we realize that some species are more similar in their DNA, not only in their appearance, but in their DNA, in their molecular machinery, to other species than they are to a third species. And therefore, the inference, the logical inference, the plausible inference is that the two that are more similar to each other came from a more common recent ancestor than the others. Now, since this pattern is repeated over and over for millions and millions of species, okay, and it always holds, that's a pretty good argument in favor of a natural process that has changed organisms over time, which is what evolution is. Another fact about evolution is that natural selection, and we'll talk about natural selection again in a minute. Natural selection is one of the two fundamental forces of evolution, driving evolution, that makes possible for organisms to adapt to their environments, to their conditions, to the conditions in which they live. How do we know that? We know that because it happens every day under our eyes. This picture illustrates a human T cell. This is a human blood cell, which is being attacked by these little tiny things. These little tiny things are molecules of the AIDS virus, the HIV virus that causes AIDS. The reason the AIDS virus appeared only recently in the human population is because it evolved from an ancestor that was present in chimps, in closely related chimps. The reason the AIDS virus is so effective in humans is because it was so effective in chimps, and chimps are very similar to humans. We have pretty much the same molecular machinery, we develop in pretty much the same way. Obviously we're not identical, but we're similar enough, evolutionarily speaking, and certainly from the point of view of the virus, to be common targets of the same virus. The same process of natural selection, this is the AIDS virus evolved by natural selection, which tells you right there that natural selection doesn't necessarily do good things. It does things, but not all of them are good. Another common affirmation of creationists is that evolution is a theory in crisis. And mostly they point to this man who is right off the screen. This guy here is named Stephen Jay Gould. Some of you may have heard of him. There it is. Stephen Gould is a paleontologist. That is somebody who studies fossils. He's a professor at Harvard University. He's written several popular books on evolution. Now, he has also been author of a rather controversial theory which is called punctuated equilibria. I won't go into the details of what that is, but basically what Gould has suggested is that evolution, which is here summarized by a branching tree, you can think of the tips of these trees as different species. Okay? And what Gould has proposed is that, in fact, the evolutionary process happens in bursts and then calms down for a long time. This is a punctuated equilibrium. That is, an equilibrium for most of the time, there's stasis, nothing happens, and then all of a sudden, by geological standards, all of a sudden means in a few million years. It doesn't mean from today to tomorrow, okay, or from one generation to another. It means relatively rapidly. Species change, probably in response to new environmental conditions. So this is what Gould proposed. The classical theory of evolution, on the other hand, can be seen as, in this diagram, as indicating that change is always pretty much gradual. There's never a burst anywhere. Gould is fond of baseball, and he said that evolution really looks like a baseball game. Most of the time, nothing happens. And then all of a sudden, you're there buying your hot dog, you come back, and everything happened, and you missed it. Well, that's exactly how he thinks of evolution, except that the time that it takes you to get to your hot dog is a couple of million years. Now, this theory of punctuated equilibria has been discussed since 1972, since it's been proposed. There's been empirical tests. It has withstood some of these tests and not others. So the current consensus within the evolutionary community is that they're both right some of the time. That is, in some cases, evolution actually is a very gradual and very slow process. In some other cases, by geological standard, it accelerates a little bit. But Gould, by his own reckoning, is a Darwinist. He's an evolutionary biologist. He never said that anything in his theory actually denies the theory of evolution. It's just a complement. It's just an addition to it. And that is an important point, because that, as I said, is how science works. Science is not a monolithic unit of knowledge that never changes. Okay? We find out new things. So there are things that we find out today that we didn't know when Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859. Good thing, otherwise I would be out of job. Okay. What am I being paid for? If not to uncover new things that Darwin didn't know, or that Gould doesn't know, for that matter. Okay. Another common statement by creationists, made by creationists is, unfortunately you can't read this very well, but it says, since we don't know whatever, there's a blank here, evolution must be wrong. That is, the argument is made that since evolutionary theory is not a complete theory, it doesn't explain everything, then there must be something funny about it. Again, this is a misunderstanding of the way science works. No scientific theory is ever complete. A scientific theory is a set of statements in mathematical, sometimes in mathematical form, that explain most of the reality as we understand it, and they are compatible with the empirical data as we have them. That doesn't mean that any particular theory explains everything. Okay, the theory of gravity proposed by Newton a couple of hundred years ago didn't explain everything. That's why Einstein got his theory of relativity as an improvement on Newton's theory. Okay? So the fact that something doesn't explain everything, it's not at all a good argument in favor of an alternative theory. An alternative theory has to stand on its own. It's only fair. You can't take advantage of the fact that somebody else doesn't have a complete explanation of things. Think about it. There was a time during human history in which we didn't know what caused thunder. And we thought that Zeus up on the Olympus was causing it because he was getting angry at something. Well, we know better now, okay? So the fact that we didn't know at the time, that didn't mean that meteorology was not a science or that meteorological theory was not good. At the time, wasn't good. There was no such a thing as meteorology at the time. But today we know better. Another common statement, there are no transitional fossil forms between major groups of animals. That is simply not true. I can't believe that people actually make that statement, because it's not true. If you actually go into the literature, there is plenty of fossils. Here is an example. All of these animals over here are transitional forms from very early reptiles down here, which lived on this earth about 350 million years ago, all the way up here to mammals. And these are the transitional forms. If you look at it closely, you will have to go up there, but I can give you a copy of the actual slide, or point you to the reference. This is all published stuff. You will see that it's very difficult to tell where is it that the mammals start and the reptiles end. It's a continuous series. So there are plenty of fossils and intermediate fossils. How about this one? These up here that you see are the skulls of a bunch of primates. Which one is human? I bet you can't tell, partly because you can't see it. But if you could see it, that's the problem with having a large audience in a large place. But if we were in my classroom of an evolution course for the upper undergraduate level, where there are only 15 people, you would see very well. And you wouldn't be able to tell which one is which. Or you'd be able to tell some of these things. You can clearly tell that this guy over here, it's definitely not a human. But when you get in the middle of the group, it's a little more difficult. And the reason it's a little more difficult is because what you're looking at is your own tree of ancestry. These are your progenitors. These are your cousins. These are your sisters, and so on and so forth. From a species level, of course, not in the literal sense. Okay? And the fact that it's difficult to say where the pre-humans end and where the humans start is another thing that is perfectly in agreement with a theory of gradual change, like evolution is, and natural change. Now, of course, I could keep up showing you slides after slide after slide of intermediate fossils, and somebody will come up afterwards and will say, yeah, but you didn't show the intermediate between A and B. You showed a lot about the intermediates, but not those particular two. Well, of course, the fossil record is far from being complete. Fossilization is a very rare process. It takes a lot of time for things to fossilize, and it's a very unusual process. So we only have a tiny little portion of fossils, of organisms that actually survived as fossils. They didn't survive really because they're dead, but they came to us as fossils. Okay? So it's no wonder that we don't have all of the intermediates. In fact, we're not even close to having all the intermediates, but that's not what science requires. A logical explanation only requires that some of the intermediates are present and that those are in the right places. For example, why is that funny cartoon up here? What has got to do with fossils? Not much, but I'll explain in a second. Suppose that this is you over here, and you're having a conversation with a friend of yours, and then across the street you see this man walking in that direction. Now you see him over here a couple of times, okay, 1 and 2, then you resume conversing with your friend, then you turn again your head and you see him over there. Now you have at least 2 different hypotheses to explain what happened. You can think that the man was actually over here all the time while you were not looking, and all of a sudden as you turned, he jumped over there with no intermediate position. There was nothing in between. It just disappeared in one place and reappeared in another. Or, that's possible, okay? You were not looking, so you don't know. Or, you can think that, well, more likely what happened was that this person just kept walking and you simply did not observe it. And then when you turn your head, he was way far ahead, and therefore you sort of assume, reasonably enough, that in fact that there are intermediate fossils over here. You just don't happen to have seen them. That's the same situation with paleontology. Okay. If I see all the fossils in the right places, but I don't see all of the fossils, that is not a problem for the theory of evolution. You would not expect to find them all because it's an historical process which is pretty rare. But if you find them in the wrong place, now that's a problem. Okay. If you do see that man jumping over here and then over there and then back over here, then it becomes a problem. So if you really do find human fossils, for example, together with dinosaurs, which never happened, contrary to the claim of some creationists, then you'll be in trouble. Because we know that dinosaurs existed much earlier than humans. Okay? So there is a way to falsify the theory of evolution, to demonstrate that it's wrong, except that so far it hasn't happened. It could happen tomorrow. And if it does, I'll come back here and tell you. How can a random process such as evolution explain complexity? Well, that would take a whole lecture in and of itself, and besides, not many scientists are even sure of what complexity is. There is a lot of discussion in science of what is it that we consider complex? How do you measure complexity? But by and large, you know, a human being is certainly more complex than a bacterium. There is not much question about that. So how do we explain that? Well, evolution is the result of at least 2 different processes. One of which is mutation, the appearance of new variants in the population, okay? Things that look different from what was there before. Mutations are caused by changes in the DNA, in the information molecule that actually forms human beings and everything else that is living. That process truly is random. Mutations do occur at random. However, there is a second component to the evolutionary change, and that is natural selection. Natural selection is a process by which some of those variants survive and produce offspring, and some don't, or some produce fewer offspring than others. By that process of successive elimination, Some variants, some mutations become dominant in a population and others go extinct. That process is definitely not random because it depends on survival of the individual that carries that mutation. If that mutation carries an increase in the fitness of that individual, and there are beneficial mutations, I can demonstrate them to you. I generate them almost every day in my lab. There are mutations that are beneficial. There are a lot of mutations that are not beneficial. But nevertheless, it's the combination of these two processes, one of which is non-random and the other one is random, that creates complexity. So evolution is not the result of a random process. Therefore, when creationists say something like evolution is equivalent to a tornado going into a junkyard, through a junkyard, and creating all of a sudden a jumbo jet out of that mess, that's not true. Because that will be a truly random phenomenon. There is no natural selection there, okay? So this is not an accurate representation of evolution. It just doesn't work that way, and if you say it works that way, that means you don't understand how evolution actually works. Organisms are so complex that they must have been designed. The argument from design has been around a long time, and of course it makes intuitive sense. It appeals to people. It was, as you probably know, actually originated way before Darwin by William Paley, who was a pastor in England. And he simply noticed that if you go around on the beach and you find a watch, you immediately deduce from the existence of that watch that there was a watchmaker. Similarly, the argument goes, if there is a designed organism, an organism that clearly has been designed to, for example, swim in the water or fly in the air, then there must have been a designer. That argument is fallacious because there's two ways to get a design. There is an artificial intelligent design. Indeed, it is true that watches are created by humans. There is no question about it. And then there is natural design. Natural design is recognizable from artificial design because usually it's far from being perfect. Okay? All the parts don't work together as they're supposed to work in an ideal world. And you find the hallmarks, you find the clues that tell you that actually that was a gradual process. It happened little by little. It didn't just pop into existence. If you look at watches do pop into existence. You don't find intermediate fossils for the watches. You see the watch that is completely functional. Before that, it's in the fabric, in the factory, okay? You don't see it. But if you look at the fossil record, or if you compare different organisms living today, you do see intermediates. For example, this is the evolution, highly summarized, this is a brief history, of the evolution of the eye, which is one of those structures the creationists say couldn't possibly be the result of a natural process. Well, these are the eyes seen in section of several different organisms. This is the eye, the very simple eye of a gastropod named Patella. It's a kind of it's a flat snail. This is the eye of a worm who is smiling right here off the screen. This is the eye, it's a little bit more round. It's the eye of another kind of gastropod, like the nautilus, which has a coiled shape. This eye is typical of shelled mollusks, and you can see now that it starts looking a lot more like an advanced version of the eye, which is like the human eye. And then finally down here, this kind of eye really looks a lot like the human eye, and it is present in squids and in fishes. And in fact, it's not very different from the human eye. Now, if you look at the human eye, isolated from everything else, you'll say, well, how did that happen? But if you look at this sequence, this is exactly what you would expect if this was the result of a natural phenomenon. But recently, some creationists, like Dr. Michael Behe, who is a biochemist, like Dr. Gish, published a book called Darwin's Black Box, in which he said, yeah, fine, we now understand how the eye evolved. He did grant that much in that book. But he said, when you get to the molecular level, things are just simply too complex. Molecules, biomolecules, are simply too complicated. He called this phenomenon irreducible complexity. That is, you get to the bottom line and there's just no way to get a molecule of DNA or a protein or whatever else out by natural means. Well, what you're looking at here are three molecules that are present in living organisms. These are 3 amino acids. And you can see that the chemical structure is very similar And you can think of these as intermediates. You can see how easily you can change one amino acid over here into another one, and this thing is quitting me, over there at the center. Okay. So there are intermediates also at the molecular level. It is not true that there is no way to get molecules by natural means. Evolution violates the second principle of thermodynamics. I'm sure we'll hear this again tonight. No, it doesn't. The second principle of thermodynamic, which is a very well-established principle in physics, simply says that disorder, the amount of disorder in a system, which physicists call entropy, has to increase in the universe at large or in a closed system. A closed system is a system that is isolated from everything else, that doesn't have any energy or materials coming into the system. Well, the reason that evolution can create order, that is, organisms become complex, organisms are very ordered things, okay? There is a very high level of order inside each one of us. Our entropy, from a physicist's point of view, is very low. The reason we can do that is because we live in a place that is not a closed system at all. The Earth is not a closed system. The Earth receives materials, the biosphere receives materials from the rest of the Earth, and the Earth itself receives energy from outside of the planet, from the sun mostly. Okay? So, since those assumptions of the second principle are violated by the biosphere, there is no contradiction between the existence of a biosphere and the evolution of a biosphere, the evolution of organisms, and the second principle. If you go that way, if you still insist that there is a distinction there, it's really a bit like saying that a bird defies the law of gravity because it can fly. Well, technically, yes, it does, okay? Because it keeps going way up there, while in fact it should come down because it's heavier than air. So technically it does, but in reality it doesn't. And the reason it doesn't is because the bird, if you want, is cheating. It's using energy to flap his wings and be up there. As soon as he stops flapping his wings, you can guarantee that the law of gravity will take over and go down. Similarly, until you and the rest of the biosphere keep eating, you're alive. At one point, your system, however, cannot keep up with the increased disorder inside your cells. Your cells and your DNA slowly degrade because of the second law of thermodynamics. And eventually you'll die. From a physicist's point of view, I took a course in biophysics once, and the biophysics professor told me that from a physicist's point of view, death is a sudden increase in entropy. Okay? All of a sudden you become very disordered. Evolution is the root of evil. I'm sure you have heard this argument before. I don't know what you mean by the root of evil. Evil is a pretty complicated thing, and as you might know, different people have different ideas of what is evil and what is not evil. However, I will attract your attention to a couple of facts. First of all, evil has been around a lot more than Darwin has. So you can't blame evil just on the fact that somebody published a book in 1859. It's also hard to demonstrate that evil increased after the publication of The Origin of Species. It's how do you measure evil anyway? Okay. It's a very difficult argument to make. But suppose that there were negative consequences or even evil consequences of the theory of evolution. So what? The theory doesn't have anything to do with ethics. It's not a guidance to morality. It's just an explanation of how things work. So by the same token, should we abandon the atomic theory because a result of the atomic theory was the atomic bomb? I would argue that the atomic bomb is much more evil than a lot of other stuff that has been attributed to evolution. But that doesn't make the atomic theory wrong. The atomic theory is just the atomic theory. It works. And in fact, one of the demonstrations that it works is that we did get the atomic bomb and it works. Okay? Now, the use of what we make out of that theory is entirely up to us, and we can be capable of good things or evil things. But the thing itself doesn't have any evil intrinsically. It just is. Science is just another religion. Creationist Philip Johnson has been fond of saying that over and over. He's published a couple of books lately in which he claims that that is the case. Well, how do you define religion then? If you look it up in any dictionary, the definitions of science and religion are very, very different. And if you ask a lot of people, they will probably agree that the two things are quite different. I'm not saying one is better than the other. The two really don't address the same problem anyway. Okay? Science, as I said before, doesn't have anything to do directly with morality. Scientists can be moral or immoral, okay, evil or good, but science per se is neutral from that point of view. Well, there is a rundown there of the differences between religion and science. All religions, we're not talking just about the Christian religion, are based on an immutable doctrine. By definition, it's a matter of faith, okay? Science is a self-correcting mechanism. In science, there is such a thing as peer review. You have to convince other people that you're right. And you're always questioned. Even after you publish, somebody else can publish another paper that demonstrates that your work was bogus. It can happen at any time, even after you're dead. There's no rest, okay, for a scientist. So one is based on faith, the other one is based on evidence. Those are completely distinct processes. No scientist believes in everything just because somebody else tells him, or because it's written somewhere. I want the evidence. And as far as the natural world is concerned, that is the way to go. As far as spiritual matters and ethical matters, this is a different question. How can you use evidence to address spiritual and ethical matters? It's a completely different discussion. But what we're discussing here tonight is evidence about the natural world. Religion is taught on authority and on revealed word. Science is a peer review process, and it's based on hypothesis testing. Every time that you propose an hypothesis or a theory, somebody is going to go out there and test it. So they are very different. Science negates the existence of God. This is a very touchy matter, and we are in a church over here, so I'm under no impression that people here don't see a connection between those two things. Of course you do. Is there such a connection? Well, yes and no. There are some things that are in the scriptures of almost every religion that can be refuted by scientific evidence. That does not, in and of itself, refute those religions. The two are distinct. In other words, if you make a precise statement, like all the animals on the earth survived the flood because of Noah's Ark, well, that's a precise statement. In fact, it's very precise because the Bible, as you know, actually reports the exact size of the ark. And it describes how the process actually occurred. Well, not only there is no scientific evidence that that is actually the case, that actually happened, but it is a scientific impossibility. You just cannot fit the whole biosphere in an ark of that size. When people wrote that at that time, they didn't know much about biodiversity. They didn't know that the biosphere today is made of more than 3 million species. They didn't know anything about ecology. They didn't know how to keep separate, or that it's not possible to keep separate predators from prey. And there are a lot of other problems. How you recycle the stuff that these predators and prey produce. You can actually do the calculations and you'll see that they just don't add up. So science denies that particular story. Does that mean that the whole thing has to be thrown away? Of course not. It only means that if you interpret that particular story literally, as opposed to metaphorically, then you're in trouble. Because then you're making a specific statement that science can actually go out there and test. Okay? But if you don't, then there is no problem. No scientist is going to come up, no serious scientist at least, should come up here and say science denies the existence of God. That doesn't make any sense. It is not an empirical fact. Okay? So there is a distinction there. What is creation science anyway? We're talking about evolutionary theory versus creation science, but creation science is a lot of different things depending on who is talking. You can see up there Dr. Gish on the left, not just on my left, but on the picture. Michael Behe down there is the biochemist who wrote Darwin's Black Box, and I'm sure you recognize the Pope over on the right. They subscribe to 3 very different creation theories. Okay? Dr. Gish thinks that the Earth is actually about 6,000 years old, at least the last time that I checked his writings. Michael Behe doesn't have any problem whatsoever with evolution occurring at the morphological level, that is, changes in the appearance of organisms, and he doesn't have any problem whatsoever in recognizing evolution as a process over millions of years. The Pope goes even further, and he says in his last statement on the matter a couple of years ago that he has no problem whatsoever with evolution except for human evolution, for some portions of human evolution, when it comes down to the soul. Okay? Which, of course, is an argument that evolutionary biologists don't address. Evolution doesn't study the origin of the soul. You can't measure it, so you can't study it. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It just means you cannot study it scientifically. So creation science is actually not at all a monolithic or a coherent set body of knowledge. Now, if you think that the difference between Stephen Gould and other evolutionary biologists that I mentioned before is a great difference, here is a lot larger. So it sounds funny to me when creationists accuse evolutionary theory of being in disarray because of what are really minor modifications on the same theme, when in fact they cannot agree if the Earth is 6,000 or 6 billion years old. There is a lot of orders of magnitude of difference there. This is not just a matter of details. There are, of course, also things that creationists directly don't explain. Creation theory just simply cannot explain or has a hard time explaining. One of them is, why did 99% of all species that ever lived on Earth disappear? They go extinct. The most likely thing that can happen to a species is to go extinct. They did not disappear all at one time, so you cannot invoke the flood. We know that they disappear at different times. In fact, there were several catastrophes, which are called mass extinctions, and then there are several other millions of other instances in which species just died down. Why does that happen? Evolutionary theory predicts that that should be the case because it is a result of what Darwin called the struggle for existence. In a struggle for existence, some people lose and some people win. Some species win, some species lose. So when you lose as a species, you're not just dead, you're extinct. So that's exactly what evolutionary theory predicts. But why, from a creationist point of view, should there be 99% of species that ever existed go extinct? Another thing that creationist doesn't explain is the highly imperfect way in which living organisms are put together. And humans in particular. If you think of ourselves as high pinnacle of evolution, well, maybe so. But there are a lot of things that are wrong with us. For example, we get hemorrhoids, varicose veins, backaches, and babies, like my daughter over there, she's Callie, she's now 2.5 years old. Babies take a long time to learn to walk, about a year. Why? Is there any explanation in creation theory for that kind of events, for that kind of observations? I couldn't find any. It's an easy explanation from an evolutionary biologist. The reason for all of those things is because we're not well designed to stand up here on 2 legs. Because most of our ancestors actually were curved or used 4 limbs. We evolved as bipedal organisms only very recently, and we're not very well designed at it, which you would expect if our evolution was the result of a natural process. We're doing okay, but we get backaches. Okay. Another thing that creationist doesn't explain, creationist does not attack only evolutionary theory. It attacks a lot of other things. In fact, basically the whole of science is denied by creation scientists. For example, if the Earth actually originated 6,000 years ago and not 5 billion years ago, then there must be something seriously wrong with the current origins of the origin of the solar system, which are at the basis of current astronomy and cosmology. Now the question is, what is wrong with it? Why? There's plenty of evidence on the astronomical side for that kind of conclusion. If you deny it, you can't just say, no, it didn't happen. You have to explain why it didn't happen, why do you think it's wrong, and what do you propose as an alternative explanation. Another thing the creationist doesn't explain. Geological strata were not formed by sedimentary processes over millions of years. Well, if they were not, how do you explain the existence of sedimentary strata worldwide? Sedimentary strata are those big chunks of rocks that were deposited, according to geologists, okay, over millions and millions of years. You're looking at the Grand Canyon right there. Some people are thinking that the answer is the flood. It is not. If you do the calculations, it just doesn't add up. There's no way something like the flood could have created the Grand Canyon. You can ask any geologist if you don't trust me. I'm not a geologist, I just trust them. Okay? But there's perfect agreement within the geological community that that's not the way it happened. Now, if you disagree, you're perfectly fine, you have the right to disagree, but you have to propose an alternative explanation, because now you're throwing out evolutionary biology, which is the major theory in biology, you're throwing out astronomy and cosmology, and you're throwing out geology. You're going to get into trouble one of these days. For example, another kind of trouble, you get in trouble with physicists. Okay? Creationists deny that radioactive elements decay in a clockwise fashion, that is, little by little, on a regular basis, on a regular pattern. That decay, that is, the idea is that a particular radioactive element, for example, uranium-237, decays over time into another form of uranium and eventually over other forms of other elements. That decay, that radioactive decay, is used by geologists and by paleontologists, therefore by biologists, to actually measure the age of rocks. Because the ages of a rock can be measured directly by the proportion between these two kinds of elements, or more than two kinds of elements, that you find inside them. Since you know what the clock, how fast the clock ticks, basically, so how long it takes for one kind of element to transform entirely in another one, you just have to measure the two kinds, and you can reconstruct the whole curve, which tells you pretty much how old that rock is. Now, this is a beautiful theory, which is based on the atomic theory. If you don't believe that, you're fine, but you have to propose an alternative for the atomic theory, and that alternative better be capable of explaining a lot of other things that the atomic theory explains, including making the atomic bomb. Why are there so many different creation stories? That is another thing that creation science does not explain. Okay, let's assume that we go with the story as it is in Genesis, literally. Okay? Well, why that and not something else? There are other creation stories. For example, the world was created from the parts of a slain monster, according to the Indo-Chinese, the Korean, and the Greeks. The world was generated from an egg, according to Japanese, Samoans, Finnish, and Hindu legends. And there was no creation whatsoever. The world has always existed, according to Jainism traditions of India. Now, why believe one and not the other? Well, the answer is, of course, I believe this and not another on the basis of faith. And you're fine if you stop at that. But that's not a scientific answer at all. You have to provide reasons. Reasons that are external to the thing that you believe that as a matter of faith. Because otherwise, other things being equal, I can pick any other one of these myths or legends or stories and believe one of those. What is the criterion? The criterion is facts, hypothesis testing. That's what science is all about. That's why we actually don't believe any of these things, and we have a better explanation of how the world came to be. Why don't we teach both theories? This is a very controversial and very delicate matter which needs to be addressed. It sounds logical, and it appeals to the sense of fairness of most people. Well, okay, you may have a good argument about this thing, but if there is another argument out there, why don't we teach both in our public schools? Because education, and I don't want you to misunderstand me when I say that, it is not a democratic process. What I mean by that? You don't teach by majority vote. You teach the best of our understanding of how things are. And as I said, that understanding can change, and therefore that teaching can change. But you don't take a poll. You don't go into a classroom and say, okay, should we teach today that the earth is flat or round? Let's see how many people believe that it's flat. It's a majority. Okay, today the earth is flat. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way in any other discipline. I don't see why it should work that way in evolutionary theory. The specialists, the professionals, the people that spend most of their lives studying these things tell you that, well, yeah, there is a very good theory, and so far it's the only theory we got. There were other theories before, by the way. There are other ways of explaining. There were other ways, scientific ways of explaining modifications of organisms on Earth. The Lamarckian theory of evolution, for example, was very different from from Darwin. It was proved to be wrong. It was possible. It just didn't work. That's why we teach that. We teach Darwin and not Lamarck today. So, in conclusion, and I think I am below the 1 hour mark, the take-home message from all of this is that I don't have all of the truths. I don't have all of the answers. I have some of the answers, and most of those answers are tentative anyway. But the point of all these exercises is for you to think. A French philosopher, René Descartes, put it very nicely 3 centuries ago. He said, cogito ergo sum, which in Latin sounds grand, but it simply means I think, therefore I am. That is, the thing in Descartes' mind that made a human being was the fact that he was thinking. Thinking means questioning. You can question everybody. You can question me, obviously. That's why I'm here tonight. You should question Dr. Gish. You should question anybody else that tells you to believe something on the basis of no evidence. Ask for the evidence. Just the facts, ma'am. Where is the evidence? Where are the facts? Why do you interpret these facts this way and not the other? There will be questions tonight possibly that I will not be able to answer, and I will simply say, I don't know. The fact that I don't know doesn't mean that somebody else automatically knows better. It is possible that somebody else knows better, of course. But it doesn't mean that automatically that's the case. Therefore, I will tilt around Descartes' dictum and say, in a more Darwinian sense, that I am, therefore I think. And I will thank you for your attention, and I'll give the time to Dr. Gish.
Well, I've certainly enjoyed this presentation by Dr. Pigliucci. He has explained in a very rational and reasonable way this notion of evolution and how he thinks and what he believes about the nature of science. And about the nature of science, the true nature of science, I could not add much more to what he has said. But he didn't quite explain everything about science as it relates to origins. Now, first of all, I want to thank the sponsors of this occasion, the church here and its pastor. I want to thank John Dowdy, who has spent much time and effort in arranging all these details. He spent many weeks on that, and we're very grateful for this opportunity. I'm grateful to have this opportunity to present to you why I, as a scientist, have become convinced that scientific evidence related to origins provides very powerful support to creation, a supernatural origin, and why it is actually incompatible with evolutionary theory. Now, let us discuss first of all the nature of science. Now, Dr. Pigliucci has done this, but he left it incomplete. Now, it is true that as scientists, when we try to observe and understand and explain how the universe operates, how the sun produces its energy, how do we explain the orbits of comets, how do we explain our biochemistry, our physiology, we use only natural laws and processes to do that. How else can a scientist operate? So science is our attempt to understand what's out there, what's here in this real world now. That's science. Biology. What does the word biology mean? It's the study of living organisms. That is biology. Evolution has to do with their supposed history. Now, scientific hypotheses and theories, I think he has explained that very well. They are ideas. They are notions. The attempt to explain how things operate. Results agree with that theory, then it strengthens the theory, and we design further tests of the theory. However, if our observations contradict the theory, it falsifies the theory, and then we abandon the theory. That's the way science is supposed to operate. Now that's science. That's real science. Now, Dr. Pigliucci, he repeatedly equates evolution with science, or his position with science. Now, he's a scientist. He is not science. Science doesn't say anything. It is scientists that say things, you see. Scientists express their beliefs. Scientists do that. Science doesn't do that. Well, what about origins? Now, he says that evolution is a scientific theory. That is flatly not true. No theory on origins can be a scientific theory. Neither creation nor evolution is a scientific theory. Now, why is that so? Did Dr. Pigliucci, was he a witness to the origin of the universe? Did he witness the origin of life? No. No one has even witnessed, no human witnesses to the origin of a single living thing. Those events happened in the unobservable past. They're not repeatable in the present. We don't see apes changing into people. We don't see onions changing into roses. We don't see any significant change whatsoever. The changes that we can observe today are changes within species. There are variations. Darwin's book was entitled The Origin of Species. Many evolutionists have said that one thing his book was not about was the origin of species, because he didn't even discuss the origin of species. He discussed the variations within species. You see, creation and evolution are theories about history. Theories about history cannot be scientific theories. Evolution and creation are based upon inferences, not based upon what we can observe right now. I have never seen God create anything. I'm sure you haven't either. But we've never seen anything, no significant evolutionary change take place either. You see, creation and evolution are based upon circumstantial evidence. Now, we have that circumstantial evidence available, certainly. We have the fossil record. We have the natural laws that are now operating. And of course, one or the other must be true. There's only two possibilities. Either we were created or we evolved. You see, the errors that evolutionists make is this. They not only claim that we must use only natural laws and processes to explain the operation of the universe and the operation of living things, they insist that we must use those very same natural laws and processes to explain the origin of the universe, the origin of man, the origin of all living things. Now, in doing so, they've stepped outside of the limits of empirical science. And that is not science. You see, they claim evolution is science, creation is religion, end of discussion. That is simply not true. We have this circumstantial evidence, you see. And either God is or God isn't. Now, if no God exists, which Dr. Pigliucci believes that God does not exist, then of course he has no choice. Anyone who believes that has no choice. You have to believe in evolution. But you see, there are this other possibility that God does exist. And if God exists, there is another choice. Listen to what Thomas Huxley had to say. Now, Thomas Huxley was, in the time of Darwin, he was called Darwin's bulldog. And he pushed evolution. He was out there campaigning for Darwin and evolution. This is quoted from the Life and Letters of Thomas Henry Huxley, published in 1903. We read, quote, this is what Huxley is saying now. Creation, in the ordinary sense of the word, is perfectly conceivable. I find no difficulty in conceiving that at some former period this universe was not in existence, and that it made its appearance in 6 days, or instantaneously if that's preferred, in consequence of the volition of some pre-existing being. Then, as now, the so-called a priori arguments against theism and given a deity against the possibility of creative acts appeared to me to be devoid of reasonable foundation. End of quote. Now you see, Dr. Pigliucci doesn't take that attitude at all. He says it's unreasonable to even consider the possibility of creation. Well, if God doesn't exist, that settles it right there, doesn't it? But if God exists, you know, creation is not only reasonable and logical, it is inevitable. And we think, certainly, that all of us should consider both of these alternatives. Evolutionists, however, believe that students they're too illiterate. They're too incompetent to be exposed to the scientific evidence on both sides of this question of origins. They believe students must be protected from error and must be properly indoctrinated in what they believed to be the truth. They believe evolution is a fact and must not be subject to challenge. You heard what Dr. Pigliucci said. Education is not democratic. We decide what must be taught, what should be taught. Who's we? The evolutionists. Because they control our educational establishment. And they control much more. The creation scientists, on the other hand, believe that our tax-supported public schools belong to all of us, and that indoctrination in evolution with exclusion of the scientific evidence that supports creation in a pluralistic democratic society, which we have, is a violation of academic and religious freedoms of both the students and the teachers. Now let us understand exactly what we're talking about here tonight, the nature of this debate. First of all, evolution. Evolution is a materialistic, mechanistic, non-theistic explanation how everything came into existence. Now, I'm not saying that all evolutionists are atheists, because that's not true. But the theory is atheistic. God is not necessary. God is not involved. They believe they can explain everything on the basis of natural processes, including the very beginning of the universe and everything involved. One of the biology books in use in the United States in our high schools, entitled Biology, Visualizing Life, published by Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston, tells us you are an animal and share a common heritage with earthworms. That must be encouraging to our students. And another book, simply entitled Biology, published by Prentice Hill, tells us evolution is random and undirected, without plan or purpose. End of quote. So you see, evolution has no goal. Evolution can't look ahead and say, now we need this or we need that, let's work this out, develop wings so we can fly, or this or that. No, it doesn't do that at all. It just happens by mistakes, by genetic errors, by these mutations, which are totally random. They just happen. They're genetic error, genetic mistakes. And just so happens, somehow, they created this universe and everything in it. Creation, on the other hand, says that this universe and this living thing came into existence due to a theistic supernatural origin. And it did not take place by random chance processes, but was due to the deliberate, planned acts of an intelligent creator. Now that is a general thesis, what we are debating here this evening. Now Dr. Pigliucci has described and supports what is called the neo-Darwinian theory of evolution. All the genetic changes which have contributed to changing a little microscopic organism into people and everything in between, this is a result of mutations. Good mutations. Now the evolutionists will say, Dr. Pigliucci would say, almost all mutations are bad and are eliminated. But once in a while, very rarely now, a mutation may prove to be beneficial, and it confers an advantage, a slight advantage upon the mutant. Now there's a competition for survival, a struggle for existence. Though the good mutant, having this advantage, will reproduce in larger numbers than the original. So it replaces it by killing off the original. It is said to have been naturally selected. Now these mutations are errors, they're genetic errors. If that little microscopic organism, which supposedly evolved from non-life, if that thing had never made a genetic error, that's all there'd be on this earth today. But all these genetic errors somehow has done all of this. Now that is what is being taught in our schools, our colleges and universities as fact. That's sort of a notion. Now, however, there are some evolutionists who don't agree with that. May I have that first slide, please? We turn on to the first slide. Soren Lovetropp is a well-known Swedish scientist. He's known throughout the world for his work in biology. He published a book in 1987 entitled Darwinism, The Refutation of a Myth. Now, Dr. Lovetropp rejects this idea of neo-Darwinism that Dr. Pigliucci is defending so vigorously here tonight. He says it could not possibly be true. Mutations and natural selection would never produce what we have in this world today. Totally ineffective. He believed in sort of great big jumps in evolution. Some has called it the hopeful monster mechanism, that a reptile laid an egg and a bird was hatched from the egg. Just like that, we went from a reptile to a bird. Must have been a tremendous shock to Mama Reptile when that happened. I think she would have given up motherhood. But this is what they believe, because they say there are no transitional forms between these major types of organisms. Therefore, there never were any. This is what happened. Well, he published a book in 1987 entitled Darwinism, the Refutation of a Myth. Now, what he calls the Darwinian myth is what is being taught in our colleges and universities as a fact, and most of our schools. What does he say? Well, I'm going to call your attention to his concluding statement, and I think this is very, very significant. He says, I believe that one day the Darwinian myth will be ranked the greatest deceit in the history of science. Ladies and gentlemen, what this man describes as the Darwinian myth, the greatest deceit in the history of science, is what Dr. Pigliucci is defending tonight and what is being taught in our college and university and most of our schools as a fact. Isn't that astounding if that is really true? And we creation scientists certainly believe that it is true. We go one step farther. We believe the very notion of evolution is the greatest deceit in the history of science. Now, not that evolutionists are deliberately dishonest or deceitful, but they have been deceived or have deceived themselves into believing something that is absolutely, totally wrong. Now, Dr. Lovetup is not the only evolutionist who's challenging the theory that is being taught so widely today. John Campbell, in his chapter in the 1988 book, Entropy, Information, and Evolution, published by the MIT Press, says this concerning neo-Darwinism, quote, every one of its underlying biological tenets has proven to be a misconception. The disparities between neo-Darwinism and reality are so overwhelming that current biologists are scrambling for a completely fresh conceptual framework for the evolutionary process. End of quote. He says every one of its underlying biological tenets has proven to be a misconception. And that would certainly destroy all this explanation that Dr. Pigliucci has given here tonight, how evolution supposedly occurred. And then there's Lynn Margulis. Now, Lynn Margulis is well known throughout the evolutionary world. He's definitely an evolutionist. Her first husband was Carl Sagan. And she published a book with his son, Dorian Sagan, and in which they attacked this idea of evolution described by Dr. Pigliucci here tonight. They say that the neo-Darwinists have appealed, they have produced fanciful abstractions have been invented by the neo-Darwinists. The fanciful abstractions have been invented by neo-Darwinists to explain how evolution occurs. They say much more. And it is said that Lynn Margulis, she's a professor at the University of Massachusetts, that Lynn Margulis, at one of her many public talks, asked molecular biologists in the audience to name a single unambiguous example of the formation of a new species by the accumulation of mutations. Her challenge goes unmet, unquote. In other words, as she spoken to many university audiences where the biologists are present, she challenged them, can you describe for me one proven example where a new species has arisen by accumulation of mutation? And nobody has ever been able to offer an example. Now, if Dr. Pigliucci thinks he knows of some, I certainly wish he would communicate with Dr. Margulis and let her know about this information so she could then be silenced on this point. Now, in spite of all this, this neo-Darwinian theory of evolution is taught as a fact, as I've said, in most of our colleges and universities and in most of our schools. The theory is a lousy theory in substance. That's what it amounts to. It's not this beautiful theory that we are told, and it's a fact, you see. Now let us consider some of the crucially important evidence related to the subject of origins. Now first I want to consider the fossil record. What would we predict on the basis of evolutionary theory? Well, the evolutionists tell us that millions of species have evolved through hundreds of millions of years of time. Now, if that's true, and a little microscopic organism evolved into these complex invertebrates, some of which we'll see shortly, and then one of these invertebrates evolved into fishes, fishes evolved into amphibians, amphibians evolved into reptiles, reptiles evolved into birds, and reptiles evolved into mammals as well, and finally the lower mammals evolved all the way through the apes to man. Why, that would have produced billions times billions times billions of these intermediate forms. They would have lived and died during that tremendous amount of time. Now, we certainly should have many, many of these transitional forms in our museum. There are 250,000 different fossil species in our museums today. If evolution is true, thousands of those should be of intermediate form. Any one of us, you don't have to be trained in science to go in a museum and look at that thing. Yep, there's something halfway between a forelimb and a wing. It's on its way to becoming a bird. Or you could recognize something intermediate between, say, a worm and a fish, or a clam and a fish, something like that. We ought to see thousands and thousands of those things in our museums. Now, on the other hand, if creation is true, cats have always been cats and dogs have always been dogs. And you know today you can't cross a dog with a cat and get a dat. Have you ever seen a dat? I've never seen a dat. No, they are distinct and separate kinds. They cannot interbreed. And furthermore, we have other distinct kinds. Roses are roses, and onions are onions, and so forth. Apes are apes, and people are people. They're separate and distinct. Now, if creation is true, and these things were separately created, then they should appear in the fossil record complete. We would not expect to find ancestors for these basically different kinds of creatures. We would not expect to find intermediate, suggesting one has evolved into the other. Tremendous difference you see between predictions based upon evolution and creation. Well, now let's look at the evidence. In this next slide, we see a reconstruction of those creatures whose fossils are found in Cambrian rocks. They include, for example, trilobites, sea urchins, sponges, jellyfish, the swimming crustacean, sea lilies, clams, snails, brachiopods, worms, and many other very complex invertebrates. Now, these things are found in so-called Cambrian rocks. We find Cambrian rocks all over the world to contain these types of fossils. Let's identify them as Cambrian rocks. Most of these are still quite alive and well today. The trilobite is extinct as far as we know. But we have billions times billions of fossils of these creatures. They're very, very complex. For example, the trilobite, we see a fossil trilobite, greatly enlarged of course, and then we see the eye of the trilobite has 600 lenses. Each lens is composed of inorganic crystalline calcium carbonate, so the lenses are still there. Scientists were able to study the lens of the eyes of the trilobite. They were able to study the optics. And they were astounded to discover that the trilobite had perfect undistorted vision. He'd utilized several principles and laws of optics to construct a perfect lens. And underwater you must have a double lens to avoid distortion. Every one of those lenses is a double lens. Now, if the trilobites and these other creatures, sponges and jellyfish, clams and snails and all those things came into existence gradually and slowly by any sort of evolutionary mechanism, we must find their evolutionary ancestors. Now, underneath the Cambrian rocks are Precambrian rocks. Evolutionists believe they were laid down during hundreds of millions of years leading up to and preceding the Cambrian. Now, if evolution is true, what must we find in those Cambrian rocks? We must find the fossilized ancestors to those complex invertebrates, the ancestors to the trilobites, to clams and snails and sponges and jellyfish. We ought to find billions times billions of them. It would be no problem at all finding these things. They should be covered. Our museum should have thousands and millions of them. What do we have? No one has ever been able to find the fossilized ancestors to a single one of those Cambrian animals. Absolutely no ancestors for sponges and jellyfish and worms and brachiopods and trilobites. Every one of them appear fully formed. I'll allow an evolutionist to testify to that. The evolutionist is Douglas Fatuma. He wrote a book called Evolutionary Biology. I'm going to refer to the second edition. He's a strong anti-creationist. Let him tell us what he believes about the nature of this Cambrian. He says it is considered likely that all the animal phyla became distinct before or during the Cambrian, for they all appear fully formed, without intermediates, connecting one phylum to another. Ladies and gentlemen, that settles the matter right there. You see, this man says that we have, what does he mean by a phylum? Well, sponges and jellyfish are so different, they're put in separate phyla. They're all these creatures so vastly different from one another, put in separate phyla. A phylum is the broadest, most inclusive taxon and taxonomy. All vertebrates, you and me, and all amphibians and reptiles and birds are put in the phylum Chordata. It's so inclusive. These things are so vastly different from one another, they're put in separate phyla. What does he say? They all appear, what? Fully formed, without any intermediates connecting one phylum to another. No connecting point between clams and snails, or between any of these other creatures. Hey, now wait a minute. Hundreds of millions of years of evolution, changing a little creature into these complex invertebrates, and all that diversity, and we don't have a trace of any evidence for that. Isn't that incredible? No, it's not incredible at all. You see, they didn't evolve. This evidence proves that fact. Now, evolution has been searching for these things ever since Darwin, everywhere they could search, and they've never been able to find those creatures. That settles the matter. These invertebrates did not have any ancestors. That means we didn't have any ancestors. Now, furthermore, evolutionists tell us that one of these invertebrates evolved into the fishes. Fishes are like you and me, they're vertebrates. So supposedly an invertebrate, maybe a clam or a snail or a worm or something like that, evolved into a fish. Some believe it took 100 million years. Now, we have billions times billions of fossils of the invertebrates. We have many, many billions of fossil fishes of each basic kind. Now, if evolution is true, we must find billions times billions of fossils of the transitional form between an invertebrate and a fish. All the intermediate stages during these millions of years. After all, as Dr. Pigliucci says, the fittest reproduces in larger numbers than the preceding form. So all of the intermediate stages would be very, very large populations. Our museum should have tons of these things. What do they have? Not one. Every major kind of fish that we know anything about appears fully formed. No trace, absolutely no trace of any ancestors, and absolutely no connecting forms between these various kinds of fishes. Ladies and gentlemen, that cannot be true if evolution is true. Now, Dr. Pigliucci and the evolutionists, they want to talk all they want to about mammal-like reptiles or Archaeopteryx or whatever. But that's questionable. They're all questionable and disputable. Even evolutionists say some of these things were not what they're supposed to be. Here, the evidence is clear, unquestionable, indisputable. No one disputes these facts. I read the evolutionary literature very clearly, and that they know them. You see, they believe in evolution not because of the evidence, but in spite of the evidence. But this evidence is overwhelming. This evidence shows that evolution has not taken place. This evidence destroys the theory of evolution. There's no use arguing about anything alleged transitional form. As a matter of fact, there are systematic gaps between all major kinds of plants and animals. Now, everybody's interested in human origins. Well, I'm going to take a few minutes to discuss this. I have a book entitled Evolution: The Fossils Still Say No. I have a 100-page chapter on the origin of man. I discuss all of these various suggested intermediates. I'm going to talk about just one. I'm going to have to do it quickly or we'll run out of time. This creature is called Australopithecus. Australopithecus was first discovered in South Africa in 1924. These are some of the fossils discovered later in Africa. This is a skull discovered by Dr. Louis Leakey and his wife Mary in East Africa in 1959. We can see that this creature was very ape-like. It has a sagittal crest, a bony ridge on the top of the skull. It's typical of ape. Has no forehead, very flat skull, massive eyebrow ridges. The brain was about 1/3 of the human. So it's very grossly ape-like. But Dr. Leakey and others claim that the teeth were somewhat more man-like than those found in apes. So it's on its way to becoming people. Now, later on, Dr. Donald Johanson found fossils of similar creatures in Ethiopia in about 1973. One of these was, he called these creatures Australopithecus afarensis. One of these creatures was of a female, about 40% complete. He named her Lucy. And although, as we will see, Lucy is essentially an ape from the neck up, he claimed that she walked upright in the human manner. Therefore, she was intermediate between ape and man, as were her fellow creatures. And overnight, Johanson became world famous, as did Lucy. Ladies and gentlemen, please meet Lucy. That's Lucy. Now, later on, they discovered enough material to reconstruct the skull of these creatures. This is the skull of Australopithecus afarensis. What are you looking at? The skull of an ape. It had the jaws, the teeth, and the face of an ape. The brain was 30% of the human. And all of these Australopithecines have long curved fingers and long curved toes. What do you use long curved toes for? Walking around on the ground? I say you do not. You use long curved toes and long curved fingers for clinging to branches, swinging from tree to tree. The idea that these things walked upright is just simply contradicted by the evidence. Now, but this is generally accepted. This is what we read in our textbooks, what we see on television, what we see in National Geographic. But there are some scientists who disagree totally, and these scientists are not creationists, they're evolutionists, and they've certainly done their homework. One of these scientists, Dr. Solly Zuckerman, for many years the head of the Department of Anatomy at the University of Birmingham in England. He was first knighted and became Sir Solly Zuckerman. Later he's raised to the peerage by the British government and became Lord Zuckerman in recognition of his distinguished scientific career. Lord Zuckerman had a scientific team that rarely numbered less than 4 that studied fossils of these creatures for 15 years. And they were studying fossils of these creatures supposedly 1 to 2 million years younger than Lucy. That is, more recent in time than Lucy. If anything, they should be more human-like. But after all this many years of research, Lord Zuckerman and his scientific team declared these creatures did not walk upright. They were not intermediate between ape and man at all. One of his former students, Dr. Charles Oxnard, professor of anatomy and director of the graduate studies at the medical school at the University of Southern California for some years. Now he's at the University of Western Australia. This scientist studied these fossils. He studied their foot bones, their leg bones, the knee joint, the pelvis, using the very most sophisticated method of analysis known in anatomy. After these many years of research, careful research, this scientist declared these creatures were not intermediate between ape and man. They certainly did not walk upright in a human manner, and he said they were not human ancestors. Do you see that in the newspapers or National Geographic or in the textbook? No, you don't see that, do you? But this is a considered judgment of these scientists after many, many years of research, and others have concurred in many respects. Now, Lord Zuckerman said in this area of science, that is search for man's fossil ancestry, he said he didn't believe there was any science in this field at all. Now, why would he say that? Well, let me give you a few examples. This is a picture I took in the San Diego Museum of Man about 20 years ago. It's of a creature, a model of a creature called Ramapithecus. Now you visit this museum 20 years ago and you're standing in front of this creature, what would you say? There's living proof of evolution. Now we know evolution is a fact. Why? Well, that creature's not an ape, he's not a man. He's intermediate and walking erect in a human manner. How could you ask for better proof of the theory of evolution? But you would not know at that time all they had of that creature was a few pieces of the jaw and a few teeth. That's all they had. Using that scanty evidence and their preconceived notion, that was their model of Ramapithecus. Well, since that time, they found additional material of this creature. They've been able to have a more accurate reconstruction of what he looked like. Now on the left, we see the skull of an orangutan, a modern ape. On the right, I'm sorry, can you move the slide, move that over just a little bit to the left? We see this is a reconstruction, modern day reconstruction of the Ramapithecus. Look at that, compare it to that. And the face, it is exactly the same. Now, these same scientists who told us 20 years ago that Ramapithecus was intermediate between ape and man said, no, we were mistaken. We were misled by our preconceived ideas. Now they're telling us that Ramapithecus was essentially the same as a modern orangutan. Not intermediate at all. You want to know what Ramapithecus really looked like? That's an orangutan. That's what he really looked like. You see a considerable difference between that real creature and the model. Now on this next slide, we see a picture of Piltdown Man. This is a picture I took from a 1937 issue of Life magazine. Fossils of this creature were discovered near the village of Piltdown, England in 1912, in some gravel there. The jawbone was quite ape-like, but the teeth appeared to be human-like. The skull was quite man-like, but they put all of it together in a single individual, incorporating these ape-like and human-like features. They named him Eanthropus, or Don Man, and he became known as Piltdown Man. And the consensus of the world's greatest authority, Piltdown Man was our subhuman ancestor, until the 1950s, when he was shown to be a hoax, a fake. Someone had taken a jawbone of a modern ape and a human skull, treated them with chemicals to make them look old, altered the teeth to make them look human-like, planted the bones in the gravel, and fooled the world's greatest authorities. And it is amazing how many ape-like features those experts could see in that human skull, and how many human-like features those experts could see in that modern ape's jaw that were not there at all. You and I say, I will believe it when I see it. They saw it because they believed it. Now, 1922, just one tooth was found in western Nebraska. Created a great deal of excitement among evolutionists because they thought in that tooth they could see intermediate features, intermediate between ape and man. The fact is, they couldn't decide whether an ape-like man or man-like ape. He became known as Nebraska Man. And in December 1922, the Illustrated London News published a picture of Nebraska Man based upon the descriptions of the scientists. There we see the earliest man tracked by a tooth, an astounding discovery of human remains in Pliocene strata. Sure enough, there's the man, there's his wife, there's the tools they were using based upon one tooth. Isn't science a fascinating subject? Well, a few years later, they discovered some additional remains of this creature. He turned out to be neither a man-like ape nor ape-like man. He turned out to be a pig. That's right, it was a pig's tooth. Now, ladies and gentlemen, look at that picture. Look what an evolutionist can get based upon his preconceived ideas, based upon a pig's tooth. Now, these were good scientists. They were careful scientists, but they were misled by what they believed. Dr. Pigliucci said they don't believe anything. Oh, yes, they believe. Oh, they do believe. They believe. I'm telling you, what they believe is just incredible. Well, now here we have some other examples. The Neanderthal man, Neanderthal people. Fossils of this creature was found in Germany in about the time of Darwin. Other fossils were found throughout Europe and other places. In 1908, they found a nearly complete fossil of an adult male. And he looked like he couldn't quite walk upright. He sort of shuffled along, and so the Neanderthal people was portrayed as these long-armed, knuckle-dragging, beetle-browed, stoop-shouldered, bow-legged subhuman. He called Homo neanderthalensis, not Homo sapiens like you and me. Well, later on they discovered other fossils of these creatures who walked completely upright in the human manner. They finally realized that that fossil found in France was an arthritic old man. The only reason he didn't walk upright, he had a bad case of arthritis. When x-rays became available, they x-rayed the bones and teeth of these people, revealed that they suffered severely from rickets. Rickets is caused by a deficiency of vitamin D. If you don't get enough vitamin D, you cannot absorb sufficient calcium from your food, so your bones become soft and deformed. We get plenty of vitamin D today. It's put in our cereal, milk, and so forth and so on. But these people did not get enough vitamin D. They had rickets, which caused the eyebrow ridges and sloping foreheads and things like that. It is now believed by almost all of the paleoanthropologists, Neanderthal people were fully human, Homo sapien. And this is a modern day version of Neanderthal man from the American Museum of Natural History. You see, Neanderthal people were not our subhuman ancestors, they were human. Nebraska man was not our subhuman ancestor, he was the pig's tooth. The Piltdown man was not our subhuman ancestor, it's a combination of an ape jaw and a human skull. Ramapithecus was not our subhuman ancestor, he was a modern ape. Same as a modern ape. And so it goes on and on and on. Lord Zuckerman said this. He said, if we exclude the possibility of divine creation, then it'd be obvious that man must have evolved from an ape-like creature. But if he did, there's absolutely no evidence for it in the fossil record. Well, I would agree with Lord Zuckerman. If man evolved from an ape-like creature, there's no evidence for it in the fossil record. Now I want to introduce a bit of humor to wake up everybody. Made possible courtesy of evolutionists. Now, most evolutionists believe that man has evolved from some ape-like creature. But do you know that there are some evolutionists that believe the reverse is true? They say we have characteristics that are more primitive than those found in apes. So it must be the other way around. Ape-like creatures evolved from human-like creatures. We wrote to one of these fellows. He's at the Director of Primate Research Center at Emory University. We asked him, do you really believe this? He says, yes, I do. You know, this is such an astounding suggestion, I thought I'd better get a second opinion. So I went down to that marvelous zoo we have in San Diego, and I talked to a little orangutan, a little ape. And I said to him, little fellow, do you know that there are some evolutionists that tell us that you came from people? People that may have looked like me. What do you think about that? Let's see what he thought about that. Well, it was obviously, it astounded him. His hair stood on end, his eyes popped out. He said, no way did I ever come from anything that looked as funny as you do. Well, I agree. I don't believe apes came from people, and I don't believe people came from apes. It is true, some of my ancestors may have hung by the neck, but none of them ever hung by the tail. No, we were not created in the image of apes, we were created in the image of God. I would conclude this section by saying this. Evolution is the substance of fossils hoped for, the evidence of links unseen. Now, let us leave the world of the past. Let us consider the evidence for design and purpose. Now, Dr. Pigliucci says this evidence for design is not real. It just appears to be that way, you know. Well, when we see it anywhere else, we assume design had a designer, don't we? You see an arrowhead, what do you believe? Did an arrowhead just come about by chance? No. It had purpose. It was designed for that purpose. Therefore, it was created by an intelligent creator. And there's many more examples. Darwin said that if we could describe only one example of an organ or structure whose origin could not be explained by his theory, that would falsify his theory. Well, there are thousands of such examples. I want to describe only one this evening. I could describe many. I'm going to have to step over to the overhead for this, and we'll turn off the projector. Now, here we see a jet engine. Now, no one would deny that this is a complex structure, very, very exceedingly complex, as a matter of fact. No one would deny that it has purpose. It serves as an engine to drive an aircraft, get it off the ground and thrust it through the air. So it has purpose, undoubtedly. No one would deny that all of its components have purpose. The rotors and the stators and the bearing, the drive shaft, the transmission or differential, whatever, all of these parts shows the evidence of purpose, and they were designed to fulfill that purpose. So no one would deny that this is evidence of an intelligent agent, an intelligent creator. And we notice how it all has to work together. Integrated, the integration we see here. If just one part is missing, the entire mechanism fails. Everything has to be there, or nothing works. Well, you say, that is something created by man indeed, but that doesn't relate to nature. Well, let's see. What do we see here? Well, I'll tell you what we're looking at. Turn that around. We're looking at a little bacterium, Escherichia coli, commonly called E. coli. This is a little microscopic organism, little bacterium. And it has these, what we call a flagella, that can drive it forward or can rotate it and tumble and everything else. Those flagella serve a very important purpose in moving this organism so it can go to the source of foods, it can escape some harmful ingredients and so forth and so on. Now, let's take a look at the mechanism of this flagella. And I'm going to show you only one of these. Now, this is the flagella, this little propeller, you might say, on these bacteria. Here we see the flagellum. And then here's what's called a hook. It's really a universal joint. And it can swing this flagellum around in various directions. And then we go down through the shaft here, and here we see the rotors, the stators, and there's a motive force here. Almost some of the very same things we saw in that jet engine. Now, this is an incredibly complex system. You cannot imagine the complexity of this just looking at this. Now, you say that we invented the wheel. That little bacterium had a wheel long before we came along, according to evolutionists. You had the wheel, rotors, stators, differentials, or universal joints, propellers and bushings and all of that. This is the only one of these flagella in that organism. Now, could it come about simply by chance? That's what Dr. Pigliucci believes. Now, this is the motor system of this little organism. Now, I'm not going to go over to take time to describe all these things. I'd never get through. But look at the incredible complexity of this motor system. It can rotate counterclockwise and clockwise, and it approaches various things, and there's various responses. There's a genetic cause, there's a physical chemical causes, mechanical causes, polymorphism, all of this sort of thing built into this little microscopic single cell bacterium. Now, that's a motor system, but that's not all. Let's take a look at its sensory system. You see, it has to have a sensory system. It has to know where there's food. It has a sensory system. If there's some sugar there, it can move in that direction. It can move in the direction where there's food. If you have this in a solution and you drop a little tiny drop of acid in there, which is harmful, it'll immediately move away. It senses that that is harmful and dangerous. So it has this very complicated sensory system. Do you know there's at least 100 different proteins involved in all of this? 100 different kinds of proteins. What do we see? Purpose, don't we? To move that bacterium where it needs to be and away from danger. We see the evidence for design. Each one of those functions are designed to accomplish its purpose. And we see integration. None of this works unless everything works. Take out one of those molecules, protein, just one of the 100, the whole system fails. Now, that is incredibly complex. We see the evidence for purpose and design now. Would you believe that this just came about by a bunch of genetic mistakes? How could that happen? You see, you have one genetic mistake, and supposedly it's beneficial. But you can't do anything at that stage. It doesn't do anything. It has no function. You don't have a flagellum. You don't have all this apparatus to drive that flagellum. You don't have the motor. This has a motor, a proton motor. You know, it's got to have a motor to do that. It's got to convert energy into this motor and cause those flagella to rotate. It's got a motor. And you see, if one thing is missing, it won't work. Now, Dr. Pigliucci rightly tells us that we don't know everything, and we never will know everything. You know, it's not what we don't know about this theory of evolution, it's what we do know. We do know what it says. It says that everything came about by these genetic mistakes, these mutations, random, no purpose, no design, no plan, no intelligence. And all this incredible complex machinery finally came into existence. No, it didn't happen. It could not happen. Because it all has to be there, or nothing works. And it all couldn't get there. You see, a little bit at a time. And that was the very substance of Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box. Now, is this, well, maybe this is exceptional. Well, let us see about that. Here's a statement from Scientific American. Now, I assure you, Scientific American is one of the most rabid anti-creationist book there is. Well, journal. In this journal, January 1995, on page 64, we read this statement. Every living organism represents a successful integration of many biomolecular machines that convert energy from light or raw chemical form into whatever the organism needs. What does it say? Every living organism, from a bacterium to you and me, has many biomolecular machines to accomplish what we need for reproduction, for life, and so forth and so on. It's pervasive throughout all of nature, throughout the universe, and throughout biology. We see this evidence for design and purpose. And to say that that's just apparent, it's really not true. It just looks that way. No, it does look that way, doesn't it? Because it is that way. Well, I could describe many, many other examples. Irreducible complexity. That is, if you take away one little part, the whole fails. Nothing works until everything works. These facts just absolutely destroy the theory of evolution. Now, Dr. Pigliucci has referred to the second law of thermodynamics, says it's no problem. We have an open system, got all that energy coming from the sun, no problem. Now, just a minute. What do evolutionists say? They say everything in its entire universe, billions of years ago, was concentrated into a cosmic egg. Nobody knows where the cosmic egg came from or how it got there. Someone said perhaps a cosmic chicken laid the cosmic egg. Well, I've never heard a better explanation for its origin than that yet. But there it was, and for some inexplicable reason, the thing exploded in this big bang. What came out of that big bang? Only two things. Hydrogen, the lightest element in the universe, and helium, the next lightest. And mostly hydrogen. That's all, just molecules of these simple gases, and they raced out at an enormous speed. And that's all there was. You might as well say the universe was hydrogen gas. Then somehow, stars created themselves, and galaxies created themselves, and eventually our solar system created itself. Life evolved from non-life, and evolved in everything living today and that has ever lived. Now, if that's true, you and I can trace our ultimate origin back to what? Hydrogen gas. That's right. We went from hydrogen gas to people. Someone has said if that's true, then you could say that hydrogen is an odorless, tasteless, invisible gas, which if given enough time becomes people. Well, that must be true. If there's nothing but hydrogen gas, now there's people. Where do we come from? Hydrogen gas. You know, as a scientist, I don't know how people can believe that. Isn't that incredible? Isn't it unbelievable what an unbeliever must believe in order to be an unbeliever? It's just unbelievable. But that's what they believe. Now, you see what they're saying? Out of the chaos and disorder of this Big Bang, and the simplicity of hydrogen gas, this universe created itself by a process of self-transformation. Ladies and gentlemen, if science is science, if natural laws are natural laws, that is impossible. There's this second law of thermodynamics that tells us everything runs down, everything decays naturally. Any system left to itself goes from order to disorder, from complex to simple. There are no exceptions. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip a quote by Isaac Asimov. What Isaac Asimov said this: everything wears out. Our clothing, our houses, our machines, our bodies. We just don't have to do anything. Just do nothing, and everything wears out all by itself. He says the entire universe is wearing out. Yes, that's true. Every star in this universe is burning up its fuel. Now, if there is no God, or if God would not intervene, this universe is going to die someday, you see. Because the day will come inevitably when every star in this universe has burned up all of its fuel. And then, I'm sorry, I don't care whether you paid your utility bills or not, the lights are going to go out. And there's not going to be any more activity, there's not going to be any life anywhere in this universe. That is a certain natural destiny of the universe. I have confidence that God's not going to permit that to happen. But if there's no God, that's going to happen. You see, here's my question, here's my challenge to Dr. Pigliucci. Would you please explain how this natural laws and natural processes that now govern the universe are causing its inevitable death and destruction? How could those very same natural laws and processes create the universe in the first place? Is it possible that the very same natural processes which are destroying the universe could have been responsible for its origin? What sort of tortured logic would one have to use to reach such an impossible conclusion? The second law applies without exception to an isolated system. The second law of thermodynamics says an isolated system will go in one direction and one direction only, and that's downward. It will inevitably go from order to disorder, from complex to simple. Never, ever will it become more highly organized, more complex. Never, never, never. And yet evolutionists believe the universe is an isolated system. Nobody did any work on it. Nothing came in from the outside. It started in its chaos and disorder and the simplicity of hydrogen gas and transformed itself in the universe we have today, which is incredibly complex. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not possible. If natural laws are natural laws and science is natural laws, that could not have happened. The universe could not have created itself. Neither could life create itself. Molecules floating around in the water. If there were ever such things, do you think they could get together and make complex molecules, which then get together and make complex systems and then make a living cell? Absolutely not. Things just don't naturally go that way. They disperse, they break down, they're destroyed. The only reason life is possible on this earth was to have a layer of ozone around the earth, which absorbs that deadly destructive light from the sun, allowing the visible light to penetrate. The fact that we have green plants on this earth that can absorb that visible light and convert it into useful forms, into chemical energy, and they can create things, and we eat the plants. That's the only reason life is possible. But there could have been no ozone on the earth if evolution is true. No oxygen is tolerable. It would oxidize everything, destroy everything. So the evolutionists say there was no oxygen. No oxygen, no ozone, because ozone is oxygen. That deadly, destructive ultraviolet light would come right down this earth and destroy everything. You want to destroy DNA, you want to destroy proteins, you want to destroy amino acids, irradiate them with ultraviolet light, or zap them with electrical discharges. One fellow used lightning, simulated lightning, to try to create life. What happened to you when you get hit by lightning? Do you become more organized and more complex? I said, say not. You get obliterated, don't you? And that they say life could have come into existence by being zapped by lightning. It's ridiculous. This second law of thermodynamics destroys the theory of evolution, ladies and gentlemen. People, they can argue all they want to about open and closed systems. They start with an isolated system and they violate the second law of thermodynamics all the way. Now, we have one more line of evidence that's related to the origin of life. If I have time to do that, how much time do I have? Just 2 minutes? Well, I'm not going to be able to do that. Let me just say this, ladies and gentlemen, about the origin of life. Sir Fred Hoyle, the very famous astronomer, some years ago, working with another well-known astronomer and mathematician, Wickramasinghe in England, these two scientists wanted to work on the problem of the origin of life. So they started out by making assumptions about the minimum requirement to get life started. They assumed every star in this entire universe had a planet like the Earth. They assumed the universe was 20 billion years old. Then they calculated the probability of life evolving anywhere in the universe in that 20 billion years. They couldn't believe their results. According to their calculations, the probability was essentially nil. Sir Fred said the probability of evolutionary origin of life anywhere in the universe is equal to the probability that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard would assemble a Boeing 747. Well, they rightly concluded that evolutionary origin of life was impossible, therefore it had to be created, therefore there must be a God. And they were atheists when they began those studies. Finally, let me say this. The significance of the subject of origin is extremely important. If God is our creator, he's the Lord and master of all that he has created. There must be some relationship between the created and the creator, and God controls our destiny. We see it's very, very important that we understand the true nature of origins. And I believe absolutely, aside from what the Bible has to say on this subject, and I certainly accept what the Bible has to say about our origins, setting that aside, we can know on the basis of the scientific evidence that God or a creator must exist, some supernatural agent was responsible for our origins. So I maintain the best scientific statement we can make about our origin is still, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Thank you very much.
Negative rebuttal is 15 minutes.
Well, let's strike. I guess I'm the affirmative, right? There's plenty of things to rebut here, and of course I'm not going to spend another hour answering each one of Dr. Gish's points. I can't do that. I'm more than welcome, however, usually after these debates, if anybody wants to talk to me, we can do it immediately after the debate, assuming that you're not tired and completely sick and tired of the whole thing. Or you can email me. My email is my last name, which is difficult to pronounce, but you can find it on the program, at UTK, that's University of Tennessee, Knoxville, .edu, that's for education. So if you want to ask other questions you don't get to ask tonight, please feel free to do that. In the next few days, weeks, months, I'm going to be around, hopefully. Okay, so points to answer. Dr. Gish said that there is no theory of origin that can be scientific because nobody was there. Well, that's a misconstruction of science. Science is not about being there. There's some experimental sciences, like biochemistry, for example, in which Dr. Gish was trained, that are about being there. I mean, biochemistry, if you do an experiment, you have to be able to reproduce a result right now or in any other place in the world, in any laboratory in the world. But it doesn't always work that way. According to Dr. Gish's definition of science, astronomy is not a science because it's an historical discipline. Well, I bet that a lot of astronomers would get really upset about that. You can do science in an historical sense. There is no problem. You don't have to be there. The way it works is pretty much the way a policeman or an investigator finds out about the scene of a crime. You don't have to be there watching the crime to find out who the culprit is. If that were the case, our criminal system would be in big trouble. Instead, there is a science named criminology that actually studies pretty much how you reconstruct events in a logical and consistent way that brings you to the answer. Now, in historical sciences, as in sciences in general, however, the answers are provisional, as I said before. There is no problem there, it's just the best that we can do. Yeah, we would like to know for sure, but we don't. I haven't heard any better alternative because Dr. Gish wasn't there either, so he didn't see what was happening. It's just that the scientific explanation of what happened makes a lot more sense than the explanation Dr. Gish gave. By the way, Dr. Gish actually did not give a single explanation of absolutely anything in the last hour. Have you noticed that the only thing that he's done has to try to poke holes in the theory of evolution, which is perfectly fine, but he has not proposed any alternative theory. That's why creation science is not a science and evolution is. Evolution is a science, therefore it is fair to attack it where it doesn't go well, where it doesn't explain things, and we'll try to find out why it doesn't explain things. But I haven't heard a single thing on the other side. That's not fair. That's not a scientific debate. That's a debate about science versus known science. It's a use of a double standard. Dr. Gish also mentioned that I am an atheist. I don't know why that has anything to do with the thing that we're debating here tonight. I didn't know this was a debate on the origin, on the existence of God. I don't think that's the point of this kind of debate. As Dr. Gish pointed out himself, there's plenty of evolutionary biologists who are theists. So the fact that one person is or is not, it doesn't really have anything to do with the debate at hand tonight. And I would like you to think about that for a second. Dr. Gish also said that evolution, he had a problem with my saying that evolution, teaching, and democracy, the argument that we don't teach in a democratic way. Well, we don't do a lot of other things in a democratic way. In front of the law, there is democracy, but in every other field of human inquiry and endeavor, there isn't. If you have a problem with your car, unless you're good with the car, what you do? You go to the mechanic. And you trust that the mechanic is the expert and he does a good job. If he doesn't do a good job, then you go to somebody else or you sue him. But normally, that's what you do. If you have to have an operation, a brain surgery operation, you go to the surgeon and you don't say, well, I'm going to question exactly where you should cut and where you should not cut. You just trust the expert. Why do you trust the expert? It's not a matter of trusting authority. It's a matter that that person has spent several years, in some cases decades of his life, studying that stuff. So when Dr. Gish says, with a background in training in biochemistry, he tells us that Lucy really did not walk upright, that the Australopithecus was really not an ancestor to human beings, because he knows better. I find that difficult to believe. What he's doing there is questioning, in fact, he's flatly denying the conclusion of hundreds of scientists who have been working for decades to find out exactly those things. Now, I don't believe things just because somebody tells me, but I have respect for people whose main job is to do that particular thing. These are experts on primates. So, if I'm not an expert on primates, and I'm not, I work on plants, well, I tend to follow what the expert on primates tell me, which, by the way, brings me to this thing. I don't think there is any serious evolutionary biologist who actually thinks that, that apes descended from man. I don't know who Dr. Gish was referring to at the Emory University Primate Center, but it just happened by chance, because I didn't know he was going to say this, to have a book here called Good Natured on the societies among chimpanzees, which is written by Frans de Waal. Frans de Waal is at the Primate Center at Emory University, and I can guarantee you that he never would say anything of the sort. Dr. Gish has quoted several scientists. Now, the problem with quotations, of course, is that they usually are out of context. You have to read the whole thing before you actually understand what that person was saying. It's pretty easy to pick up a couple of quotes and put them out of context and say, see, Professor Gould didn't know what he was talking about, or Isaac Asimov didn't know what he was talking about. Well, I didn't know which particular quote Dr. Gish was getting tonight for this debate, but I did find a few interesting ones in his published stuff. One of them is in Evolution, the Fossils Still Say No, which he published in 1995. And that's a quote from Stephen Gould, the character that was right off the screen at one point in my presentation. The quote from Gould, according to Dr. Gish, is, "The fossil record with its abrupt transitions offers no support for gradual change." Period. Well, I went back and checked the quote from Gould. In Natural History, volume 86, page 22, published in 1977, this is what Gould actually said. "The fossil record with its abrupt transitions offers no support for gradual change, comma, and the principle of natural selection does not require it. selection can operate rapidly. So you can see that if you listen to the whole thing, it has exactly the opposite meaning that Dr. Gish gave it. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that you have to stop quoting people somewhere. But you have to be careful. If you quote somebody, it has to be in context, or you have to take the time to explain the context, because it's pretty easy to make people sound like fools when they're actually not. Dr. Gish said that evolution is atheistic and pretends to explain the origin of the universe. Well, that's news to me. Evolution is a theist-neutral theory. That is, it doesn't make any statement about the existence or non-existence of God. There is no such a thing. When I teach my evolution class, I don't say, and by the way, you have to start by assuming that there is no God. The assumption is that we can explain processes by natural forces. But that doesn't say anything about the existence or non-existence of God. Furthermore, evolution doesn't have, and let me clear this thing for once and for all, evolution does not have anything to say about the origin of the universe, or for that matter, about the origin of Earth. That's astronomy, that's cosmology, that's change, that's not evolution. Evolutionary theory, as is intended by Darwin and by the so-called neo-Darwinians today, to which, as Dr. Gish said, I belong, deals with once life started, how did things change on Earth? And that's what I'm here to debate tonight. If you want to debate on the origin of the universe, you better call Stephen Hawking or some other cosmologist who will tell you much better than I can how the origin of the universe actually occurred. I know a few things about it, but I'm not qualified to discuss that, and it doesn't have anything to do with evolution. It's a different thing. It's a different question, okay? It is a very valid question. It's a very interesting question, but it is a different one. There is nothing in Darwin or in no evolutionary biologists that have ever written about the origin of the universe. Dr. Gish keeps referring to mutations as errors. Mutations are not errors. If you call them an error, that's assuming that there is a design, there is a plan, and somebody's made a mistake. Mutations are differences, they're changes. Something goes in a different way in the DNA molecule, and therefore that causes a particular consequence. That consequence can be a positive or a negative one. If it is a negative one, then you can conclude that that was an error, and it's going to be selected out by natural selection. But if it was a positive, how can you possibly call an error something that causes a positive effect? And as I said, I invited already Dr. Gish to come to my lab and see plentiful of mutations that actually cause positive effects, that is, they increase fitness. Soren Lovetroop quotation, 1987, that's the scientist that proposed the so-called theory of the hopeful monsters. Well, I find very funny that Dr. Gish actually picks up on that example. First of all, the actual hopeful monster theory was not proposed by Soren Lovetroop in 87, but by Richard Goldschmidt in 1940. And it has been a serious contender for evolutionary theory for some time. People have taken it seriously because Goldschmidt was a serious geneticist. They've done the experiments, they've proven it wrong, and now that's it. It's taught in the history of biology textbooks, not as a modern theory of evolution. It just doesn't stand up to hypothesis testing. What Dr. Gish is referring to over and over, the fact that scientists make mistakes. Let's take the example of the Piltdown Man, for example. It was a hoax. Yes, but who found out that it was a hoax and why? It was not a creationist, I guarantee you. No creationist went there and said, no, this is a hoax and here's why. Who found out were other evolutionary biologists, because other fossil remains of humans that were found in the meantime just did not fit with Piltdown Man. There was something wrong with Piltdown Man. Every other fossil fell exactly in the position that is predicted by evolutionary theory, but not Piltdown Man. So somebody finally went out and said, what the heck is this Piltdown Man? And it turned out it was a hoax. So evolutionists found out because that piece of evidence did not fit with evolutionary theory. It would have falsified evolutionary theory if true. It turns out it was not true. How much time? 2 minutes, thank you. There are no examples of observed creations of new species or speciation events. Yes, there are. I'm flabbergasted that that's the claim. There's plenty of examples in the literature. What kind of examples do you want? Do you want invertebrates? Yes, we have observed fruit flies and other insects forming new species under our very eyes in the last 50 years. There are several plant species, new plant species have been observed, and there are several, even a couple of vertebrate species. There's a couple of seagull species that have occurred, that have originated in the last 50 years or so. So what do you mean there is no evidence of the origin of new species? Of course, it's a rare event. Remember that evolution occurs over millions of years. So it doesn't happen every day that you observe these kind of things. The fact that human life is too short, it's not fault of the evolutionary biologists. But again, evolution is also an historical discipline. There are no intermediate fossils of living organisms, of living kinds. I showed you several. There are several intermediate fossils that originated modern whales, modern giraffes. There is the transition between reptiles and mammals. There's tons of living examples of plants which are intermediate from different species. There's tons of examples of invertebrates living today which are intermediate. People cannot tell, well, does this belong to species A or species B? There are tons of hybrids that are formed between species and intermediate forms that are difficult to tell apart. So how can there not be any intermediates? Trilobites, they are perfect because they have hundreds of double lenses to see underwater. Yeah, but what about all of those other invertebrates, the overwhelming majority of which don't have the double lenses and don't have such perfect eyes? How does Dr. Gish explain that? Well, the evolution explanation is that it took several hundred millions of years for the trilobites to get there, and therefore you observe a bunch of other things that have not gotten there, that are intermediates. Dr. Gish also quoted Douglas Futuyma, a leading evolutionary biologist, in 1986, saying that there are no intermediate forms of animals previously to the Cambrian period, or the so-called Cambrian explosion, when a lot of modern animals came about. Well, that was 1986. The quote is out of date. In 1998, Futuyma published a new edition of the same book, in which there are plenty of Precambrian fossils that are discussed, several of which are the ancestors or are forms similar to the ones that have been seen after the Cambrian. How did vertebrates come from invertebrates? That's a great question. We don't really know much about that. We know that the most similar invertebrates, the closest ancestor to the vertebrates among invertebrates are sea urchins and starfishes and things of that sort. Well, but people are working on it. It's not that the evolutionary biologists are necessarily idle. A woman named Billy Swala at Vanderbilt University has published a couple of years ago a brilliant paper in Science, one of the leading scientific magazines, showing actually how you can turn an invertebrate into a chordate, which is the actual ancestor of vertebrates. Thank you.
Well, I had to put the cassette or whatever it is here in my pocket. I hope it's working all right. I believe it sounds all right. Now, he said that I offered no support for creation. Ladies and gentlemen, the fossil record that I described is precisely what the creationists would expect and predict. That is absolutely positive evidence for creation. The fact that I described about the evidence for design and purpose, that is positive evidence for creation. That is what we would expect. It's what we would predict. The nature of scientific laws, the second law of thermodynamics, is exactly what a creationist would expect. The evolutionist says things are going this way. The creationist says no. God created, and we would not expect things to become more complex, more highly ordered, going up some evolutionary scale. But if something did happen since creation, it could only cause things to go downward. And that's what we find. Things are deteriorating. The entire universe is wearing out, perfectly in accordance with the predictions of the creationists. And the probability relationships, if you try to calculate the probability that amino acids will arrange themselves in a precise order to make a protein molecule just by floating around in the water, first of all, they never combine one with another. Absolutely not. I'm a biochemist, a protein chemist. I know that that doesn't happen spontaneously. You have to make it happen. You can do it in the laboratory, but it never happened in the ocean. And they'd never line themselves up in the precise way to make a protein. They had to be lined up just as Sir Fred Hoyle said. They had to be created by an intelligent creator. That is positive evidence for creation. We offered very much positive evidence for creation. Now I want to name even one scientist who said that apes came from people. I'll name that scientist, Jeffrey Bourne. Dr. Jeffrey Bourne. His name is spelled B-O-U-R-N-E. He was director of the Primate Research Center at Emory University when I saw an article in a magazine in which he was quoted as saying that apes came from people. So we wrote to him. We asked him, did you really believe this? He says, yes, I do. And others have said the same thing. I've read other articles in the scientific literature. Apparently, some things have missed. Dr. Pigliucci, he said, I quoted Gould and I quoted him out of context. Now, I have quoted Gould extensively in my literature, in my books. My latest book is Evolution of Fossils Still Say No. And I don't quote out of context. Now, what he did say, there's no evidence in the fossil record for gradual change. That's the fact. That's the fact I was describing. Now, his explanation of why that is true is a different matter. But that's what he said. If he didn't believe it, why did he say it? Now, Dr. Pigliucci says mutations are not errors. Well, may I ask Dr. Pigliucci then why we have this incredibly complex system in our cells, in our bodies, and in the bacterium to repair mutation? Do you know when a mutation occurs? When the wrong nucleotide is put into a DNA molecule, there's a mechanism that edits the DNA as it is reproduced. It edits this DNA, and as it sees the wrong nucleotide, that's a mutation. That's an error. It cuts it out and replaces it with the correct nucleotide. Now, it's not always perfect. It doesn't always work. So some of these things slip through. If there were not errors, then why is our bodies and why are cells trying to correct these non-errors? Yes, they are errors because what? They're just random. They just happen, not because they are needed or anything like that. And these errors are supposed to change a little microscopic organism into human beings. Now, he mentioned biogeography. He showed a picture of marsupials on one side and placental animals on the other. The marsupials are found in Australia. Nobody knows why all those marsupials went there, but evolutionists and creationists agree that they migrated there. They certainly did not evolve there. No evidence for that. But the significant thing is, you see, evolutionists believe that things evolve by chance, by these random accidental mutations. He said that, let me just bring another point on that. Here's another quotation from Douglas Fatuma, Evolutionary Biology. What he says this. He says this, by coupling undirected, purposeless variation to the blind, uncaring process of natural selection, Darwin made theological or spiritual explanations of the life processes superfluous. The point is this, what is Dr. Fatuma saying? That you have this blind, uncaring process of natural selection coupled, he said, by coupling undirected, purposeless variation, that is these mutations, blind, to the blind, uncaring process of natural selection. That's how we got here. Evolution is a random process. There's no question about it. What natural selection actually does, ladies and gentlemen, natural selection does work. But what it does is preserve the species. It eliminates the oddballs, those things out on the fringe. It preserves the species. The most fit organism, in any case, is the average individual. That's what natural selection does. He says there are examples of transitional forms. He mentioned the mammal-like reptiles. Well, let's see what Tom Kemp says about mammal-like reptiles. He published a book, Mammal-like Reptiles and the Origin of Mammals, in 1982. On page 3 of that book, he says, of course, there are many gaps in the synapsid fossil record. Synapsids are these mammal-like reptiles. There are many gaps in the synapsid fossil record with intermediate forms between the various known group almost invariably unknown. Page 3. Page 327. The apparent rate of morphological change in the main lineages of the mammal-like reptiles varies. The sudden appearance of the higher taxa, families, and even orders immediately after a mass extinction with all the features more or less developed implies a very rapid evolution. And a quote, you see what he's saying? You have an extinction, suddenly there's these new forms already, all the features already formed. They didn't evolve. How could they evolve? He says gaps at the lower taxonomic level, species and genera, are practically universal in the fossil record of the mammal-like reptiles. The gaps are almost universal, he said, in the mammal-like reptile. No, they don't offer evidence for evolution whatsoever. And he mentioned Cambrian. Ladies and gentlemen, in those Cambrian rocks, we find clams and snails and trilobites and things like that. Now, I said, nowhere on the earth have they ever found fossilized ancestors to those creatures, and that's true. They have found some other fossils they believe are older than the Cambrian, but they are not ancestral. They cannot be ancestral to those Cambrian animals. Absolutely. The Cambrian animals, those things that I showed on the screen, all appear fully formed. There's no question about that. Absolutely. There's no transitional form. He's trying to say that I presenting old material. I follow the evolutionary literature very carefully. Our institute subscribes to 50 different scientific journals, and we buy all the latest books on evolution. We study those very carefully. And I'll tell you right now, I know that nobody's ever found evolutionary ancestors to those Cambrian animals. And he admitted we have no transitional form between the invertebrates and the fishes. Ladies and gentlemen, that fact alone destroys evolution. That cannot be true, and evolution be true as well. Now, he mentioned the Grand Canyon. Do you know that the geologists who are familiar with the Grand Canyon, the geology of the Grand Canyon, no longer believe the Colorado River cut the Grand Canyon? I'll tell you why. What they believe is this: that plateau, where the Grand Canyon is, was uplifted 65 million years ago. The north rim is about 8,500 feet. The south rim is about 7,500 feet. So that was uplifted, they say, 65 million years ago. Now, according to their ideas and their dating systems, they say the beginning of the Colorado River was only 4 million years ago. So if what they believe, and I don't agree with this, but if they believe that this thing was uplifted 65 million years ago, and the Colorado River came along 60 million years ago, would it climb up over that and go down and cut a canyon? No, run right around it. They have no theory on how the Grand Canyon formed. They don't know how the Grand Canyon formed. We do have certainly some very good ideas how the Grand Canyon may have formed. Well, he says creation denies all of science. Oh no. We believe in creation because of science, the facts of science, the fossil record, the second law of thermodynamic. Dr. Pigliucci says that the origin of the universe and the origin of this solar system has nothing to do with evolution. Oh, I'll tell you one thing. You pick up a high school biology book and you'll find theories on the origin of life. There'll be a chapter devoted to the origin of life, and almost all of them will have some idea, something to say about the origin of the universe. Oh, yes, it does. How can you have evolution unless you have an earth? And how can you have an earth unless you have a universe? You see, it's all tied in together. He doesn't want to talk about the origin of the universe. No, he doesn't want to talk about that. He doesn't want to talk about the origin of life because he knows that it has absolutely no answers scientifically. He says, why so many creation stories? Well, people dream about these things and so forth and so on. We believe, personally, I believe the record of creation is found in the Bible. Now, we are not discussing the Bible or anybody's theology. I agree with Dr. Pigliucci. We're not here to discuss anybody's theology. But I certainly have to say my position is based upon a theistic supernatural creation. Why are so many creation stories? Well, anybody can dream and create stories, but we believe nothing compares to the record of creation found in the Bible. Now, he says about Piltdown Man that it was the evolutionists who discovered the Piltdown Man, the fraud. Do you know who discovered it? It was a chemist. That's who it was, a chemist. They analyzed the bones for the incorporation of certain chemical that's found in the soil. And it's incorporated into the bones as they stand in the bones. They found that the jawbone had none of this in it at all. The skull had a little bit of it. But they could not be fossils. They could not be old at all because they hadn't been sitting in the ground at all. Now that was discovered by a chemist. He measured the amount of fluoride in those bones. As they stand in the soil, they'd absorb fluoride from the soil. The jawbone had no fluoride in it at all. Couldn't be a fossil, couldn't even be any older than 1912 when it was found. And the skull had some fluoride, but it certainly was not 500,000 years old, as the evolutionists claimed. It was the chemist who it wasn't the paleontologist, or it wasn't the anthropologist who discovered this, it was the chemist. And anybody should have been able to discover that fraud. If they looked at those fossils in a careful way at all, they would have discovered the fraud. But it fit their ideas, they liked it, and they didn't look at it very carefully. Now he says new species are occurring, and he has examples. I wished he would contact Dr. McGulis and let her know about this, because she would like to know. Certainly, she's going around and telling false stories. If he knows of species that have evolved or have formed as a result of accumulation of mutations. The scientists say it has not happened. It's easy to say that it has happened, but it has not happened. And he says he knows a lot of good mutations. Well, I wished he'd put that in the scientific literature. Because when I asked an evolution, would you please describe what you think is a beneficial mutation? They talk about sickle cell anemia. An individual who inherits this sickle cell gene from one parent, he's not quite healthy. He's not quite as healthy as normal, but he will survive, and he is resistant to malaria. So they say, now there is a mutation, which is a good mutation, because it renders him resistant to malaria. But you know what? If that person marries another person that has that same sickle cell gene, 1/4 of their children will die of sickle cell anemia. Now, is that a good mutation? I should say not. The person who has it is not well. He can survive, but he passes that bad gene on to the offspring, and they die of sickle cell anemia. Is that a good mutation? I should say not. It's a bad mutation. Thousands of genetic diseases in humans are traces to these mutations. If there's a lot of good mutations, I wish Dr. Pigliucci would just describe one or two. That would be helpful. Mutations are bad, they're harmful, they're certainly not beneficial. Well, how much time do I have? 2 minutes. Now he said that eyes, many creatures have eyes, and they evolve many times. You know what the evolutionists say? Yes, eyes did evolve many times independently. Can you imagine an eye, as complex as it is, could evolve once by these random mutations? That's hard enough to imagine. But imagine that it happened many times. That makes it incredibly difficult. And you know what? The vertebrates, the very simplest, most primitive vertebrate on this earth, has the same eyes that you and I have, essentially, the vertebrate eye. There's no sense talking about the origin of the vertebrate eye. They just suddenly appear. Now, about the invertebrates, there are different kind of eyes, but some of the very simplest eyes are found in the most complex invertebrate, and the most complex eyes are found in some of the most simple invertebrates. There's no rhyme or reason to support evolution based upon the origin of eye. Their complexity and purpose and design speaks of intelligent creation. Well, I've assumed I've run out of time, and thank you again.
Okay, a few more things to answer. First of all, where are beneficial mutations described? If Dr. Gish would like to take a look at the December issue of the Journal of Genetics, 1998, for example, you will find a paper modestly published by myself. I'm sorry if I have to quote my own stuff, but I was challenged on it, in which there is a description of several mutations found in my laboratory actually increase fitness quite a bit. This is not an isolated case. I'm not the first one. If I were the first one, I would have gotten a Nobel Prize by now, but unfortunately, that's not going to be my future. If mutations are not errors, why is there a DNA repair system in organisms? It is true that there is a DNA repair system in many organisms, including the bacterium E. coli that Dr. Gish showed. Well, there is DNA repair mechanisms because too many mutations are not a good thing. Now, too much of a good thing is not a good thing. If you eat too much chocolate, I'm sure you will agree that that's not a good thing either. Therefore, organisms tend to limit the number of mutations. But it's very interesting to find out that that E. coli that Dr. Gish branded as an example of a perfect organism. It's actually not perfect at all. It is an amazing organism, that's no surprise. It's the result of 4 billion years of evolution. 4 billion. Bacteria have been around since 4 billion years ago. That's a lot of time. So no wonder you can invent a wheel in 4 billion years. But the question is, it is simply not true, demonstrably not true, that bacteria, all parts in bacteria have to be there for the bacterium to work. You can cause experimentally plenty of mutations, and those mutations are also found under natural conditions in bacteria, which knock out several of the functions of a bacterial cell, and the bacterial cell is doing just fine, thank you very much. Not only that, bacteria, and in particular Escherichia coli, which is the full name of that bacterium, have an interesting system which is called the SOS repair system. They have two ways of repairing their DNA. In one case, they use the same mechanism pretty much that almost every other organism uses, and that's that proof-correcting mechanism that Dr. Gish was talking about. However, if the environment is changing rapidly and the bacteria is under stressful conditions, for example, if the temperature becomes very high or the amount of UV radiation, which is damaging to the bacterium, increases, what happens is that the bacterium starts using a different system to fix its DNA. That system is called the SOS repair system. The SOS repair system actually causes mutations. Okay? So it doesn't fix things, it makes them worse, according to Dr. Gish. Well, it is demonstrably true, people have done the experiment, that the SOS system is what makes possible for that bacterium to actually survive the stressful environmental conditions. Because some of the many mutations that are caused by the SOS system are actually beneficial, and they will allow the progeny of that bacterium to survive. This can be done every day in the laboratory conditions. It doesn't take anything. Any microbiology lab can do it. It's been published, so it's not something that it's out there. Dr. Gish has studied Fred Hoyle, the astronomer, the British astronomer, who's allegedly demonstrated that evolution could not possibly occur by mathematical calculations. Well, I really don't like to attack people on the basis of their accomplishments or lack thereof. I'd like to focus on the actual results. But since there is no time here to get into why Fred Hoyle was wrong, let me tell you this. Dr. Fred Hoyle has the unique distinction of having gotten a medal from the Royal Society, Royal Astronomical Society of Britain, for the highest number of theories proposed in a scientific career that turned out to be wrong. That's a fact. Now, was he right on the theory on the probability theory applied to evolution? Of course not. Didn't I tell you that Dr. Gish was going to come up with the tornado in the junkyard argument? That argument is based on a misunderstanding, which is shared by Dr. Fred Hoyle, of what evolution is about. Evolution is not a random process. It is a combination of a random and non-random process. The non-random process is natural selection. I really have a hard time understanding why this is so difficult for creationists to deal with. Once that you have a non-random process in the mix, you can't throw out numbers, probabilities, on the basis of randomness. Because of course on the basis of randomness evolution will not occur, but we're not saying that it is a random process. So it's like trying to poke holes into something else, into a straw man that no evolutionary biologist would actually defend. I think I'll close here for now. Thank you.
Well, we've been going rapid fire tonight. It looks like we're kind of running out of things to say. We've been going so fast. Now, he said, you see, Fred Hoyle was all wrong, that evolution is not random. And it's not like a tornado sweeping through a junkyard and assembling a Boeing 747, as Fred Hoyle used that sort of illustration. The origin of life would have to be a random process, ladies and gentlemen. What does the evolutionists say? Natural selection. What is natural selection? It's differential reproduction. Some organisms reproduce in larger numbers than others. That's all natural selection is. Some things are more fit than others, and therefore they reproduce in larger numbers, therefore they replace the original. That's the theory. May I point out, ladies and gentlemen, before there's living organisms, there's no reproduction. Fred Hoyle was talking about the origin of life. Before there was ever a living thing, before there ever was reproduction. And these molecules are floating around in the water. Supposedly, I can give you 50 reasons very quickly, probably 50, why the evolutionary origin of life is absolutely impossible. It's contradicted by what we know in physics and chemistry. And now this probability, you have these molecules, supposedly amino acids floating around in the water. And they'd have to link up with one another. Now, first of all, they don't do that. Now, secondly, there's no natural selection here. One amino acid, if it could link up with another, would just do it randomly. It wouldn't care what it linked up with. If it could link up, it would just link up. Now, if you give a monkey a typewriter and some paper and let him type away, what does he type? Just nonsense. Doesn't make sense. When you take the letters of the English alphabet and arrange them in a specific way, then you convey information. You conform to the rules of language and you convey information. But monkeys could just do that randomly. Now these amino acids would combine randomly. There's no natural selection at all. The laws of probability would apply. Fred Hoyle is right. The probability of an evolutionary origin of life is equal to the probability that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard would assemble a Boeing 747. Now, Fred Hoyle is no ignorant individual. He says what he got for making mistakes. Well, that's what the majority of these astronomers believe. Fred Hoyle doesn't conform in many ways. He is a leading astronomer. Some said he should have received the Nobel Prize. He certainly knows when he talks about probability relationships and mathematics and so forth and so on. No natural selection. You could not overcome these improbabilities. Now, he says there are all kinds of good mutations. I wish that people get these. Now, I don't know. Maybe he can give me some references in the literature after this, and I can read that literature, be made aware of these good mutations. I know there's sometimes when evolution alleged that some change occurred by a mutation and it would be beneficial. But there are many other explanations to explain this. And you just have an animal or a plant that undergoes some mutation that makes it stronger or better or more fit. Listen, we have irradiated those little fruit flies for thousands and thousands of generations to speed up the mutation process. We've got a lot of bad flies, but we've never got a better fly. I'd like to close with this statement. Ladies and gentlemen, 3 or 4 centuries ago, the notion that the sun and other planets revolved around the earth was a dogma of the scientific establishment, and Galileo faced determined opposition from fellow astronomers when he suggested otherwise. Louis Pasteur and others, about a century ago, overturned the established dogma of centuries when they showed that living things never arise spontaneously from dead matter. Today, even though thousands of scientists are creationists, and the number is growing rapidly, the notion of evolution is a stifling dogma. Evolutionists seek to smother all challenges from within or without the scientific and educational establishments, concealing the fallacies and weaknesses of the theory and adamantly opposing a hearing for the scientific case for creation. Why is this so? Certainly not because the notion of evolution is science and the concept of creation is religion. I can think of 2 possibilities. First, it may be that evolutionists consider that our students are too ignorant, too illiterate to be exposed to these competing ideas of origin. They must be protected from error and carefully indoctrinated in correct ideas by those who consider themselves to be the intellectual elite, the sole possession of truth. Secondly, having engendered this fragile towers of hypotheses piled on hypotheses, where fact and fiction intermingle in an inextricable confusion, it may be that evolutionists are aware of the fact that the notion of evolution will fare badly if exposed to an open and determined challenge from creation scientists, and that if this is done, the majority of our students will accept creation as the better of the 2 concepts of origins. Whatever may be the case, it is urgent that our students be exposed to all of the evidence, all of the arguments on each side of this question, so that these 2 alternative concepts of origin, creation and evolution, can compete freely in the marketplace of ideas. Thank you very much.
The moderator will address questions, direct questions to the speakers in alternating order. 2 minutes per answer, 2 minutes for reply, 1 minute for summation, and 1 minute for summation. The first question is addressed to Dr. Pigliucci. You believe we humans most recently evolved from apes. Also, how do you believe the Grand Canyon was formed? Please reply.
The answer to the first question is yes, I believe that humans derived from apes. I don't think that's a belief. There's quite a bit of evidence that's consistent with that theory. So I don't know why that is a question, I guess. I thought I made that pretty clear during the presentation. The second question is, how did the Grand Canyon form? The Grand Canyon formed by a series of processes, the main one of which was sedimentary accumulation of sediments over long periods of time. So all those strata that you can see, all those bands you see of Grand Canyon are sedimentary rocks that accumulated over long periods of time. We can call a geologist and let us more about it. I don't know of any geologist who has a problem with the origin of the Grand Canyon.
Well, if he is not aware of that, he ought to read a little bit of the geological literature. I visited the south rim of the Grand Canyon a number of years ago and visited the museum. They described several theories about how the Grand Canyon formed. They explained its problems with all of them. And then they gave the ideas of the Havasupai Indians, who said the Grand Canyon formed as a result of a great worldwide flood. I believe it's very possible they know much more about it than the geologists do. Certainly no geologist, that is at least one familiar with the geology of the Grand Canyon, believes that the Grand Canyon was cut by the Colorado River. There's 1,000 cubic miles of material was eroded away. It ought to be down there in the delta of the Colorado River. It's not there at all. It's way out to the west, some other place. Evolutionists do not know how it formed. Geologists do not know how it formed. We believe it's very possible that it did result from a great worldwide flood. We have 350 million cubic miles of water on the earth. Mars doesn't have a single drop of liquid water, and yet evolutionists believe that great canyons up there were cut by flooding, massive flooding. They don't have a drop of water up there, and we got 350 million cubic miles here. If there was a massive dam, massive lakes up to the northeast, and there, we know that there have been, we see the fossil lakes, and they were dammed up by debris and so forth, and that debris suddenly gave way, and that huge amount of water came washing down through there when that material was still unconsolidated, cut that Grand Canyon in a very short space of time.
I'm sure that a lot of people here... Microphone. Oh, there you go. I'm sure that a lot of people here have seen the movie with Kevin Costner. I think it was called Waterworld. The reason Waterworld cannot occur is because we actually know how much water there is to go around once that you account not only the oceans, the underwater, the underground water that is available, the water that is in the atmosphere as water vapor, and of course the water that is in the form of ice at the polar caps. When you put all that water together, there's just no way you can have a worldwide flood. There's not enough water. So where did the extra water come from? And more importantly, where did it go?
It's very easy to understand where it goes. The ocean floor today is several thousand feet lower than it was in the past. We know that because there's drowned islands at the bottom of the ocean thousands of feet below the surface. We know that. And if there was a flood of this kind and the ocean floors rose and the continental floors dropped, you could flood the entire earth without a drop of rain. And so that is a very possibility because the ocean floors have subsided since that time and continental floors have risen. So there is certainly a great amount of evidence to support that notion.
Dr. Gish, Dr. Pigliucci gives concrete scientific findings and evidence for his theory of evolution. He has these findings to back the belief that possibly man has evolved. What do you have other than your faith to back that man was put here by a higher being? I don't see that you have any scientific proof on creationism or real evidence.
Well, I'd almost chuckle at that statement after spending so much time to explain the nature of the fossil record, where these invertebrates, complex invertebrates, suddenly appear. There's no ancestors, there's no transitional forms. There's absolutely no ancestors for the fishes, for the vertebrates. There's no connecting forms. How else would you explain their origin? Dr. Fatuma in another place says this, that either organisms arose from preceding organisms by gradual change, or they appeared suddenly fully formed. If they appeared suddenly fully formed, then they must have been created by an intelligent agent. Well, that is my contention. They did appear fully formed. There's no evidence that these major kinds, and I could go on and on and on, the flying reptiles, the marine reptiles, all appear fully formed. No trace of any ancestors and things like that. That is positive evidence for creation. That's what we must predict, we must expect on the basis of creation. But it is absolutely incompatible with the theory of evolution. You just cannot have hundreds of millions of years producing complex invertebrates, another 100 million years producing the vertebrates, and not leave a trace. That's not possible. Now that's positive evidence. The evidence I gave for design and purpose, isn't that evidence of a creator? The fact that we have purpose, we see it, it's all pervasive throughout the universe and through living things. And I gave you only one example. I could give you many examples of the evidence for purpose and design and integration. It's tremendous evidence for the existence of a creator, of a designer. That's positive evidence. That's data. The data I gave from the fossil record, the data I gave based on the laws of thermodynamics, the data I gave on the basis of the origin of life, that's all data, and it supports creation.
I think, as I mentioned before during my presentation, this is going to be, the audience should be aware of this. This is really an exercise in critical thinking. If you listen to Dr. Gish by himself without challenge, it sounds pretty reasonable. If you listen to myself without challenge, I think I sound pretty reasonable. The question is, during the challenge, what happens? Well, during the challenge, the devil is in the details. So you have to pay attention to the details, and you might not want to make up your mind necessarily tonight. By the way, the implication of the debate is that somebody wins the debate. Nobody wins debates. The point of the debate is to present alternative opinions. Then you go home, you think about it. You eat a sandwich, and then you think about it, then you read a book about it, and you read something else, and you email both of us, and you keep thinking about it for the rest of your lives, because this is a pretty complex topic. Now, why all this presentation, all this introduction? Notice that Dr. Gish has completely ducked the question. The question was about the origin of humans, for which there is an ample fossil record, and he talks about the evolution of invertebrates. Is that answering the question? No, but it's an important detail.
Well, he claimed I didn't produce any positive evidence, and he mentioned the origin of man. I did discuss that. I did discuss it. I pointed out the Australopithecine, supposed to be one of the most important things in human evolution, the central figure in human evolutionary schemes for many years. The experts in the field, Lord Zuckerman, Dr. Oxnard, who studied these things extensively for years and years and years, said they were not intermediate to an ape and man. They were not human ancestors. Now, what am I doing? I'm showing their evidence is faulty, that they supposedly link apes to man. I'm maintaining that these creatures were apes, and that's all they were. They were not intermediate at all. Now, that's answering the question, definitely.
Dr. Pigliucci, assuming evolution is true, please explain why it stopped and where in the strata. I am assuming it stopped because obviously it no longer occurs as a perceived constant, such as gravity or relativity.
No, evolution never stopped. It's going on under your eyes. That's why I brought up the example of the AIDS virus, for example. There is plenty of evolution is going on. One of the tasks that my students and my postdocs in my lab do is to go out there every day and measure natural selection in the making. For example, we have demonstrated that in the plant in which we work, but the same work has been done in animals as well, Not only there is natural selection, but contrary to what Dr. Gish said a few minutes ago, natural selection doesn't necessarily favor the mean of the population, the most common individual in the population. We've demonstrated plenty of evidence in which cases in which natural selection actually favors extreme individuals within a population, and that's how evolutionary theory predicts the populations change and eventually species change. So I don't know where the notion that evolution stopped came from. It's simply not true.
Well, when someone asked Dr. Theodosia Brzezinski, famous evolutionist, to describe something in the world today that demonstrates evolution, he said he didn't know of any. You'd have to go to the fossil record to find that. There is no place in this earth today where a new organ is coming into being, where a new creature is coming into existence, where something is evolving into another creature. Not one example of that is known. And it has been said, it's in the evolutionary literature, that this is true. He mentioned the AIDS virus. The AIDS virus was detected a number of years ago. What is it today? It's the AIDS virus. That's what it is. It's varied. We have many races of people. We have many varieties of finches that Darwin saw in the Galapagos Islands. What are those finches? They're finches. They're finches then, they're finches now. And not only are they still birds, they're still finches. And they interbreed and produce fertile offspring. They cite that as supposed example of evolution. You start with corn and you modify it, it's still corn. You start with a fruit fly and you do all these experiments and you radiate it and all these mutations. What do you end up with? The fruit fly, and a bad fruit fly, a terrible fruit fly, without wings or stubby wings or something like that. You don't ever get a better fly. There's no real example of one creature changing into a basically different creature, not on this face of this earth, and there should be thousands of them, because evolutionists believe that animals have been on this earth for millions of years, some for 300 million years. The coelacanth fish, been on here for 70 million years, it's still the same old fish.
I'm glad you brought up the corn. We know the corn originated from another species called Teosinte, and now we know exactly all the details, of the genetic details that actually brought up that change. You can reproduce many of those changes under laboratory conditions. You can cause the same mutations in Teosinte, which actually originated corn. So here's one example. I pointed out before that there are several other documented examples of evolution of novel species of invertebrates, of some birds, especially of plants. The reason I say especially plants is because plants are particularly easy to work with, and insects are particularly easy to work with. That's why we have most of our examples there. You have to imagine that if to obtain a new species of vertebrates, for example, a vertebrate typically lives a lot longer than an insect or a bacterium or a plant. Okay? Well, some plants live a lot longer. But therefore, it becomes more difficult to actually obtain examples in vertebrates. But they are out there. There are several examples of bird species that have been observed. Now, we've never observed, of course, directly a bacterium transforming itself into a human. That will take quite a lot of time. It actually has taken about 4 billion years. And plus, as my professor of biophysics said, the ideal of a bacterium is not to become a human, it's to become two bacteria, and that's what usually they do.
Well, they worked with, people started with a variety of corn. It was not a very good producer many years ago, and they bred and selected to have the modern corn, but it's still the corn. The genes that we find in modern corn was in the original corn, but it's been concentrated in a certain way to produce the modern variety of corn. Another example is the many dogs that we have. All these varieties of dogs, where'd they come from? From the wild dog. Man really selected certain genetic traits and kept breeding and selecting until he produced the 4-pound Chihuahua, the 180-pound Great Dane, the Collie, and everything else. But all of these genetics that we see in the modern dog was in that original dog. No evolution is involved whatsoever. We know the poinsettias, the beautiful poinsettias we have in San Diego. They came from Mexico. Down in Mexico, they're little scrubby plants. Some plant breeder years ago, just there in the San Diego area, took these things and he kept working with these, breeding and selecting and breeding until we have that beautiful poinsettia that we have today. But all of those is still a poinsettia. You see, evolution has to explain how these different kinds of creatures came into existence, how finches and canaries and ducks and eagles and so forth came into existence. That's what you have to explain, not these minor variations you can do by not what we call selection and breeding. That's not evolution at all.
Dr. Gish, please discuss the footprints at a riverbed in Texas. Does a man's footprint cross a dinosaur's footprint, and does this prove the coexistence of man and dinosaur?
This evidence has been studied down there for many years. There was someone who studied those footprints there. There are undoubted dinosaur footprints in the Glen Rose area there, Pigliucci River bed. There's no question there's their dinosaur footprints. Now, there were prints that looked like human tracks, and they crossed those of the dinosaurs. And it was maintained, therefore, that that's evidence that man and dinosaurs coexisted. Now, that has been studied very carefully. Evolutionists just reject that out of hand, of course, although some did mention this possibility. Scientists have studied that, and there's people who went down there and studied and claimed that what looked like human tracks, now 3 toes began to appear. And these were dinosaur toes. So they said that these things were really not human tracks, they were dinosaur tracks. Now, Dr. John Morris of our institute and others had studied those and believed that these to be genuine human tracks. Now, in the light of this new evidence, Dr. Morris has retracted this suggestion. He believes that they're not human tracks, that they were dinosaur tracks. And so that claim is no longer said or maintained. Nobody carved these things. They're genuine tracks. There's no question about it. The question is, what are they? There's still people there who claim that there are human tracks there. I've never been there. I have some serious doubts about the nature of the evidence that's been produced. So I never use that evidence at a debate like this or in a lecture because of the questionable nature of the evidence. I really don't believe that it's demonstrated that there are human tracks there.
I totally agree. They're not.
Dr. Pigliucci, if you could, sir, please explain your stand on the canopy theory. That, to me, would explain the 99% extinction you claim. It's called the canopy theory.
Whoever asked the question could possibly explain what the canopy theory is.
The canopy theory is the idea that at one time there was much more water vapor in the atmosphere than there is today. If there was a flood, as described in the Bible, it had to have a lot more water vapor than there is now. Because if it rained over the entire surface of the earth today, you'd only get 1 or 2 inches of rain. So there had to be much more water vapor in the atmosphere before then. It's called the canopy theory. And that is just one of the sources of the water that was produced. So that's the idea.
And where is that water?
In the atmosphere.
Why and why?
Invisible water vapor.
Invisible water vapor.
Yes.
Water vapor can be quantified in the atmosphere very precisely. We know exactly how much water vapor is in the atmosphere because even though it is invisible, you can actually measure through particular instruments, but water vapor absorbs certain portions of the spectrum of solar light, which we don't perceive, but our instruments do. So we know exactly how much water vapor is there, and that theory does not account for it.
Well, I thought I explained that there had to be much more water vapor then there is now, because you just can't get more than 1 or 2 inches of rain. Today I said that. Now there had to be much more water vapor in the atmosphere before the present time, or something that, because we find fossils of dinosaurs above the Arctic Circle, in Alaska above the Arctic Circle. We find fossils of dinosaurs in Antarctica. I just read the other day in a scientific journal, they discovered a fossil forest in Antarctica. They said 300 million years old. And they said Antarctica's always been right there where it is now. Now, if that's really true, then obviously conditions on this earth were drastically different in the past. We had a worldwide mild climate. That's the only, in other words, additional or more water vapor in the atmosphere in the past that would absorb and retain much more solar heat than the present atmosphere.
This is a great
That would
example.
create a worldwide mild climate.
This is a great example of how microphones can be annoying, of how the difference between science and creation is. Okay, if I understand it correctly, this canopy theory and water vapor theory basically makes up out of nothing the fact that there was a lot more water because we needed, in order to validate a preconceived idea. We know that there was a worldwide flood, there had to be more water, even though we have no idea where the water came from, where did it go, or if it was ever there. We're assuming, because it's convenient for our theory, that it was there. The difference between that and the dinosaurs in Antarctica, for one thing, it's not true that Antarctica was always in the same place. Actually, continents shift around, as has been known since the 1930s. Second of all, there is independent evidence that Antarctica, at the time of the dinosaurs, was a much warmer climate. How do we know that? Not simply because dinosaurs were there. That would be circular. That would be like saying, since dinosaurs were there, they had to be warmer. That's like saying, since I know there was a flood, there had to be more water. No, we know because we have fossils of, for example, tropical plants. There is also a way in which geologists can actually gauge the temperature, and from the sedimentation processes in the rocks, the temperature of a certain environment, for example, of a marine environment. So they know that the temperature was indeed higher than it is now. So there is independent evidence. That's the way science works. You don't just make up something and then you assume that the right data are there or the right thing was there, even though if you don't know anything about it. You need independent evidence.
Well, as I just said, the evidence indicates that that was much warmer down there in the past. And that article I just read said Antarctica has always been right there where it is now. And they actually believe Alaska was farther north in the past than it is today. And so you can't say that those things have been wandering around and they were in a warm climate, now they wandered down there where it's cold. No, they have been there right from the very start. And I'm basing that on the evidence. Dr. Pigliucci, the evidence that there was a warm climate down there. They had to account for it. How could you account for that? How do you account for that? How can you account for the fact that the world had a worldwide mild climate? Can you account for that without something different in our atmosphere? Certainly something had to be very different somewhere.
Dr. Gish, please discuss the scientific possibility that the ark literally held all species of animals, just as Genesis 6:8 records.
Well, that's a little bit out of the subject of the evening, but let me say this. Here's the question you have to ask. First of all, how big was the ark? What was the capacity? How many animals had to go on the ark, and what was their size? You have to know those answers to those questions. Now, the first question, how many animals had to go on the ark? You know, evolutionists often say, oh, you know, you couldn't put millions of species on the ark. I agree, you couldn't. But you didn't have to. What does the Bible say? The Bible says only the land-dwelling, air-breathing creatures had to go on the ark. Today, there are 20,000 species of land-dwelling, air-breathing creatures. Assuming an equal number become extinct, since that time, there'd be 40,000 species or 80,000 animals. What's their average size? The size of sheep. Some were much bigger, some were much smaller. But the average size is the size of sheep. Now, how many sheep, how much space would you have to require to put 80,000 sheep? 1/2 of the space available on the ark. That will leave the other 50% available for food supply, airspace, ping pong tables, swimming pools, and other essentials. So there certainly was no problem as far as the space is concerned. Now there'd be some problems with their care, but I think that was taken care of.
I don't believe the Bible mentions anything about ping pong tables, but that was an interesting addition. There are not 80,000 species of land-dwelling animals. Only in insects there are several million species of land-dwelling animals. Where the heck were they on the ark? Also, vertebrates. Some of these vertebrates are pretty large. Okay, you can actually make the calculation, even if you limit yourself to that category of animals. And by the way, what about plants? All of the plants had to be fit in there too, because they couldn't survive a flood. Okay. So we're talking about only plants, only just flowering plants today. There is about 600,000 species of flowering plants that has been described, and the current estimate is about 1.5 million. If you include other plants, there is non-flowering plants included, like ferns and pines and things of that sort, the total is much higher. Where were they? You can do the calculation. Somebody has actually done the calculation. You can go to an online archive, which is called talk.origin. And you'll find somebody actually doing the calculations, and you'll find out that it is absolutely ludicrous to believe that the actual number of species that was present at the alleged time of the flood, which, by the way, what time was that? I'm not sure what was the exact time, but if it was only a few thousand years ago, there were millions of species around. They just did not fit. And if it doesn't fit, as you know, you must acquit.
Well, first of all, only very few had to survive, and plants can survive as seeds, And actually many of them could survive floating debris. Even today, tropical storms and hurricanes and stuff like that will tear huge chunks of matter loose. They float out to the ocean. You actually have trees floating in that debris in an upright position. And the plants, it'd be no problem explaining the survival of the seeds. And of course, many did become extinct. We know that. Many did become extinct, but many survived. And you see, how can Dr. Pigliucci explain the tortoises that we find in the Galapagos Islands, 800 miles off the coast of South America? How did those land animals get there? They couldn't swim there. They couldn't fly there. How'd they get there? Well, they had to get there just the way I described. They had to float there on something, of course. And there's many, many other examples like that. We know multiplied examples of creatures that are in a certain place that had to float there. That's the only way they could get there. Some of these, like the Seychelles Island, out there in the Indian Ocean, hundreds of miles from land, has animals and plants and things like that on there. They had to get there somehow, and so they didn't have to be on any boat or ark or anything like that at all. Neither did the insects. The insects, they can survive outside on floating debris and things like that. And you don't have to put those things in there. What the Bible says, the land-dwelling, air-breathing animals. And that's what it says, and no problem.
Okay, there's so many details that have to go into it. Yes, of course plants can survive as seeds, but the question is, plant seeds don't survive in salt water, in marine water. I can guarantee you that. There's plenty of physiological literature that shows that. Trees may be floating upright in the ocean after an hurricane, but they're dead. They're not surviving trees. Okay, they can't withstand that kind of situation unless Dr. Gish wants to suggest that floating trees then all of a sudden go back on the land in the upright position and produce flowers. That would be really an astonishing kind of discovery. I'd be curious to see where did that come from. I've never seen that kind of thing described in anything that I've read in the literature. As far as insects are concerned, sure, insects can survive, but how long are we talking about? Many insects have a life cycle of only about 7 days. So where did that go? We know that they survive because they are present today. Now, I've heard in the past a different response from Dr. Gish and some of his colleagues about the flood problem and the Noah's Ark problem. That is that we only need kinds of animals to survive. And the kinds are vaguely described as not exactly a species. It's a little more generalized than a species, so the species that we see today are actually the derivation of those original kinds that survived the flood. Do I hear evolution there? That's what evolution says. A kind that originates another kind, a species that originates another species, that's what evolutionary theory suggests.
Dr. Pigliucci,
Yeah.
if hundreds of millions or billions of years are needed for evolution to have brought us to where we are, how much larger would the sun have been, and how could life have existed on Earth with such heat and multiplied gravity?
Okay. The sun was not much larger from what it is now for most of its history, certainly for the last 4 billion years. That's what astronomers tell us, and as I said, I'm not an astronomer, but I believe what they tell us. They got pretty good reasons. The sun was a larger star only right at the beginning of the origin of the solar system, when there was no Earth at that time. It was still solidifying out of gas and dust, so that was not a problem. What else? The gravity thing. Gravity, as far as I know, has never been different on Earth since the formation of the planet. Of course, before the formation of the planet, you have no gravity, because gravity is, as you know, caused by the fact that there is some mass there. There's a mass of material. So the Earth, once formed, had a certain amount of gravity and gravitational force, and that's what it has now, pretty much.
Well, there's quite a discussion about the possibility the sun is shrinking in the scientific literature a few years ago. I forget what the scientist's name was, Ron something. He made a study of the measurements of the diameter of the sun. Now, the scientists know that the sun is shrinking, but they say it goes through cycles. It shrinks and then expands, and it shrinks and expands. That's why it's shrinking. But what this other scientist maintained was, yes, there is this cycle, but overall there's a shrinkage of the sun. The sun is actually shrinking. Now, if you go back 200,000 years, now if the sun is shrinking, then it was larger in the past. You go, and this continued for 200,000 years, the whole Earth would be destroyed within about 200,000 years, something like that. At least it couldn't be here for millions of years of time. What he maintained was the sun is actually shrinking. There's data to that effect. Therefore, the solar system cannot be billions of years old. Of course, this is bitterly opposed by evolutionists. They just say absolutely that cannot be true, obviously, because it's been here for 4.5 billion years. We know that. And life evolved 4 billion years ago. We know that. So this absolutely cannot be true. By the way, they also believe, this is what they do believe, that the output of the sun was 30% less in the past. 30% less. I don't know what that would do to life on the Earth. I don't see how life could survive, how life could even have evolved under conditions like that.
I don't know where the 30% is coming from. I'll have to read up on that if Dr. Gish is so kind to give me the reference. But I do happen to have read the articles about the shrinking sun. There was quite a bit of research done over a short period of time, and the question was settled. I have the reference. It's available if anybody is interested. The sun, of course the sun is shrinking. Notice that when I answered that the sun has been pretty much, I said it's been pretty much the same. I told you that the devil is in the detail. That pretty much means that yes, stars do shrink and do change in size. The reason for that is because stars are really large nuclear furnaces. They burn nuclear fuel. When they run out of fuel, or when the fuel goes down, of course the star changes size. That's, by the way, what's going to happen at the end of the history of the sun. However, all current astrophysical models and all current observations are consistent with the fact that the sun was not significantly larger 4 billion years ago. I don't know, as I said, where the 30% less bright comes from. I don't think there is, that's the main cosmological theory. When we look at other stars, we can look at other stars. The sun is not a unique star. There's plenty of other stars like the sun that have the same chemical composition, pretty much the same age, pretty much the same temperature. And they have a certain amount of variation in terms of size. They don't vary that much. Regardless of their age, they're pretty much the same size. They are what are called main sequence stars. They are stars of middle age, pretty much, that have been burning for 5 billion years.
Well, nothing has been proved about the shrinkage of the sun whatsoever. I think we have to make many more observations in the years ahead to know whether the sun is really shrinking or not. And of course, it's not crucial to our position. If it is true, then of course that would be the end of the theory of evolution. Now, I do know, and I just read this a couple days ago, I'd say 4 or 5 days ago, an article in which it was stated that the sun was 30% less bright, or the energy from the sun was 30% lower in the past than it is today, and they were trying to take this into account and trying to work it into their theories, trying to account for that, and what the effect would be and so forth.
Debaters and audience, we are approaching the 10:30 hour. We do have time for one more question. Dr. Gish, you say that no one witnessed the beginning of the earth. If you mean there's no evidence, I beg to differ. Just because we didn't witness the transformation from primates to humans doesn't mean it didn't happen. Did you watch your daughter or granddaughter develop in utero? Yet she was stillborn, wasn't she?
No, she wasn't stillborn. She's born alive. But I have 2 beautiful daughters. I always say that they got all their beauty from the mother. The only thing they got from me was her name, and they got rid of that as fast as they could. But now the idea, read that question again. I lost the gist of it, fooling around here.
Yes, you say that no one witnessed the beginning of the earth.
Yes, okay.
If you mean there's no evidence, I beg to differ.
Yes.
Yes.
You see, what I'm saying, that there's no scientific theory. You cannot have a scientific theory about events and processes that are not observable. They have to be repeatedly observable. And that cannot be. The earth only originated once, and that's true of the universe. That's true of living things. They only come about once. They only come into existence once in the past. There weren't any observers then. And so, yes, that's ridiculous about the birth of my daughters. We know all about the process of fertilization and the development of the embryo, and we could see the mother as she grew with the child, and we could witness all that. Of course we could see that. But no one was there when the earth was born, quote unquote. No one was there when the universe came into existence. As a matter of fact, there was no witness to the human witness, that is, to the origin of a single living thing. Now, what I'm trying to say, and I'm trying to get this across, is that while evolution and creation have scientific characteristics and we can discuss them in scientific terms, neither is a scientific theory because they're not repeatable. How can you test a theory on how a fish may have evolved into an amphibian? How can you test a theory how an ape may have evolved into man? Can you run the theory? How about a theory on how the universe formed? Can you create a universe to see if your theory is correct? You can't do that. All you can do is speculate. And the speculations have turned out to be very bad.
No, you don't. The difference, as I said, Dr. Gish is clinging to a definition of science that no scientist actually acknowledges, and no philosopher of science either. That is, that sciences are only those disciplines in which there can be direct experimental manipulation. Science is much broader than that. How do we know that the universe came out of a Big Bang if nobody was there? Because if it did, it should have had, given a certain current mass of the universe, it should have had a certain temperature in the beginning. If it cooled down over 10 billion years, which is what cosmologists predict, then you should observe today at 3 degrees above absolute zero radiation all around the cosmos as a result of that Big Bang. That is, that theory makes a specific prediction of something that was not observed before. Oh, guess what? People went out there, they measured the background, what is called the background radiation of the universe, and it is exactly 3 degrees above absolute zero. That is the kind of scientific evidence we're talking about. Dr. Gish probably was not present when the Empire State Building was built. Nevertheless, I'm sure that he does not believe that it just popped out of existence out of nothing. Obviously, there were some processes, and well-known processes. Why does he believe that those well-known processes that are human-made occurred in the creation of the Empire State Building, even though it was not there? Because it makes sense from a logical perspective to actually explain the existence of the Empire State Building that way, by building and constructions, as opposed to by direct intervention of God. I don't see why that shouldn't apply to other natural phenomena as well. As I said before, scientists are really in the position of a Sherlock Holmes. That's what it is about. It's about collecting clues that put together, make sense, and provide an explanation. That explanation, the crucial thing is that explanation has to predict new things. If it does, like the background radiation of the universe, that's a good chip on your shoulder.
You know, I've been trying, and I just can't seem to get over this idea. Science is science, yes, but a scientific theory has to fulfill certain criteria. It has to be based upon repeatable observations. And you have to be able to construct a theory to test it. And there must be some way to falsify it if it is false. That cannot be done with evolution. Why? It's so plastic, no matter what the data are, you can make them fit one way or the other. This Big Bang theory that he's talking about, they came out with the Big Bang theory. It was almost literally falsified. There's all things wrong with it. So they added inflation to that. Then there's things wrong with that. And what do? They imagine, they say certain matter exists in this universe that's never been detected and cannot be seen. They call it cold dark matter. It's totally imaginary. They have to invent this imaginary matter to make their theory work. Then there's this imaginary energy now, energy in empty space that they had to invent in order to make this latest wrinkle of their theory to work. You call that science? You call that scientific theories? That's not a scientific theory. They're inventing these tooth fairies to make their theories work. It's not science at all. You see, there are other scientists who are evolutionists who believe the background radiation can be accounted for by something besides the Big Bang theory. They don't believe the Big Bang theory. They have other ideas on how the universe evolved. He said the background theory proves the Big Bang. It doesn't prove any such thing. It may be one of the predictions based upon the Big Bang, but I'll tell you, there's many, many other predictions they've made on the basis of the Big Bang that have been totally falsified. And when you have to invent imaginary matter and imaginary energy to make something work, something's wrong with that theory, that's for sure. It's certainly not a scientific theory.
If I didn't know better, I would think that Dr. Gish is Italian, because with all these hand waving around, it's unbelievable. Dr. Gish is basically asking for his own definition of science. I mean, he's repeatedly refused to follow what a definition of science accepted by scientists is. And he wants his own definition. And according to his own definition, then evolution, together with astronomy, cosmology, and a bunch of geology, and so on and so forth, it definitely is not science. Too bad the scientific community, that is, the people that actually work in that field, don't believe that that's the case. You cannot define things out of existence. Okay? If we're playing baseball, and I'm saying, okay, we've followed the rules of baseball. We've followed the rules of baseball. If you want to change the rules and you want to play another game, all of a sudden, well, you can do that, but you can't call that baseball anymore. So if you change the rules in the middle of the debate, if you say, no, this is not science, even though that's what scientists do and that's what philosophers of science tell you science is, you're inventing your own universe. And in your own universe, of course, you can always be right.
Do I have another comment?
Nope.
I'm sorry, I sure would like to comment to that. I still can't get over the difference between science and a scientific theory.
Audience and debaters, I still retain as moderator 25 unanswered, undirected questions, but the hour of 10:30 is nigh.
The moderator is out of order.
The debate is concluded.
The debate on audio cassette is available tonight for a $10 purchase, and the video will be made available. Give your name if you're interested in the video tape, VHS. Give your name and address on a form and submit it to one of the ushers, and we'll mail you information onto its availability, and we will avail that to you. I'd like to thank our moderator, Mr. Porterfield, for coming and moderating. I'd like to thank Mr. Harrington Smith, our Board of Supervisors, for being here and presenting the timekeeper. Mr. Smith has been a great friend to our congregation. Thank you, Mr. Smith. And I'd last of all like to thank our two world-class debaters. Thank you, Dr. Pigliucci, and thank you, Dr. Gish, for coming. They've gone the whole 15 rounds tonight, and I appreciate that, going into the overtime. Let's stand and have our benediction. Great God and Heavenly Father, Lord, we're grateful at the effort of these two men who have come here to present this inquiry, this investigation into the origin of the earth and the origin of the universe and the origin of man. And God, we've been able to partake of the two different worldviews, these two opposing worldviews. And as Jesus said, he challenged us to search for the truth. He said, if it were possible, that you should know the truth, and the truth will make you free and help us to obtain that freedom that Christ spoke about. And it's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.